Welcome to Sleepy Time Stories. Hey, my dear friends, come and get comfortable this evening. I'd like you to picture something with me. If you can, just shut your eyes for a little while. See yourself standing on the edge of Independence, Missouri, during the spring of 1849. The breeze smells of damp soil and burning timber. All around you, hundreds of canvas-topped wagons creak and groan as families pack their whole existence into wooden crates on wheels. Little ones race between the wagons, giggling, not yet realizing what lies in store. Men argue about livestock and provisions. And the women stand quietly, many with tears rolling down their cheeks, bidding farewell to mothers they will never see again. But here's the detail that makes your stomach churn. Here's what makes your fingers tremble as you clutch the rough wood of your wagon. You are by yourself, completely, incredibly by yourself. No spouse, no father, no sibling. Just you, a 26-year-old woman about to try something that hardly any woman has ever done. You are about to trek 2,000 miles across a land where 1 out of every 10 people will perish, where cholera can take you from breakfast to noon, where rivers swallow whole families, where simply being a woman on your own makes you a target, a strangeness, a problem no wagon party wants to handle. Would you live through it? Let's find out together. You know what strikes me most when I read the real journals of women on the Oregon Trail? It's not the huge dramatic events. It's the tiny heartbreaking details. A woman named Jane Good wrote in her diary about passing a lonely, unnamed grave on the prairie. Just a simple wooden headboard, nothing else. And she wrote, "It brought up a sad chain of thoughts. To me, it seemed so tragic to think of being buried and left alone in such a wild place, with no one to plant a flower or cry over one's grave." That was the fear. Not just dying, but dying lonely, forgotten, unmourned. And yet here you are, ready to step into that vast emptiness alone. Let me share something that most people don't understand about the Oregon Trail. When we imagine it in our heads, we see families. We see pioneer women in bonnets standing beside their husbands, children holding their skirts. And that image is mostly correct. Out of the estimated 350,000 people who traveled west between 1840 and 1869, the vast majority went as families. Wagon trains were moving communities, tiny villages on wheels held together by marriage, blood, and a shared goal. Single women of marrying age, they were rarer than gold dust. And a woman traveling completely alone, that was nearly unheard of. It broke every social rule of the 1840s and 50s. It was seen as improper, dangerous, and frankly impossible. So, how did you end up here? What chain of disasters or desperate situations brought you to this instant, standing alone at the launching point of the most dangerous trip in America? Let me guide you through the possibilities, because each one is based on real women whose stories have been kept in letters, diaries, and official records. Maybe you're a widow. Maybe your husband died 3 months ago from the fever that swept through your town, and the bank is about to take your house. Maybe he had already sold everything you owned to buy this wagon and the supplies before he passed. And now turning back means you have nothing, literally nothing. No home, no cash, no way to survive another winter in Missouri. Oregon is offering free land, and your only choice is to take this chance or starve. This happened in 1852. A man named Ezra Meeker reported meeting 11 wagons moving slowly eastward against the flow of traffic heading west. That group had made it as far as Fort Laramie, Wyoming, before losing the last of their men. The wagons were being driven by women. They were giving up, turning around, hoping desperately to make it back to homes that might not even be there anymore. Imagine being one of those women. Imagine the disgrace, the terror, the sorrow. You made it halfway across a continent and had to admit defeat. Or maybe you're not a widow. Maybe your husband is still alive somewhere, but he left you, abandoned you. It happened more than people want to admit. The Oregon Trail was brutal, and not every marriage survived the pressure. Sometimes a wagon would break down and a man would decide the woman and children were slowing him down. Sometimes there were arguments that escalated into something darker. The trail was lawless. There were no police, no judges, no one to enforce the vows made back in civilization. There is a story I came across that has haunted me ever since I read it. A woman named Elizabeth Markham was traveling with her husband Samuel and their 5 children in 1847. 6 of her children had already died before reaching age 3. 6. Can you imagine carrying that grief? And then somewhere along the Snake River Canyon in what is now Idaho, Elizabeth just stopped. She told her family she could not go any farther, just could not do it. Samuel argued with her. Eventually he took the children and moved on. Later that day, he sent their 8-year-old son, John, back to check on her. Hours passed. The boy did not return. Finally, Elizabeth came walking back to the wagon train alone and told them she had beaten the boy to death with a rock. They found John still alive, barely clinging to life. Meanwhile, Elizabeth had set fire to one of their wagons. She had lost her mind. What people called prairie fever back then, what we might call a complete psychological breakdown today. John survived somehow. They made it to Oregon, but Elizabeth's sanity never really returned. I tell you this story not to horrify you, although it is horrifying. I tell you because it shows something crucial. The Oregon Trail destroyed people. It broke them. And women who were expected to hold families together, to be the emotional and physical caretakers even when they themselves were falling apart, were particularly vulnerable. So maybe you are on this trail alone because your husband broke under the pressure and left, or died, or went mad. Or maybe, just maybe, you chose this. Maybe you're running from something worse than the trail itself, an abusive father, a forced marriage, a life of poverty and servitude. The Oregon Trail was dangerous, sure, but at least it offered the possibility of something different, something yours. There were women who made this choice. A young Mormon convert named Susanna Stone Lloyd left her hometown of Bristol, England at age 25, unmarried, alone. She crossed an ocean and then crossed half a continent to reach the Great Salt Lake.
Why?
Because she believed in something enough to risk everything. Most of these women have been lost to history, because occasionally they left traces. A diary entry, a memory passed down, a grave marker with no husband's name beside it. Here is what I want you to understand about your situation standing there in Independence, Missouri in 1849. You are not just facing a physical challenge, you're facing a social impossibility. Women in the mid-1800s were not taught how to drive a wagon. They were not taught how to harness oxen. They were not taught how to navigate by the stars or negotiate with ferry operators or judge the depth of a river crossing. These were men's skills. Women were taught to cook, to sew, to manage a household, to bear and raise children. The entire social structure was built on the assumption that women would always have men to handle the outside world. But you do not have a man, and the outside world does not care. Let me give you a sense of just how unprepared you probably are. Martha Masterson, who traveled the trail with her family later, wrote about watching her mother's heartbreak. Her father had decided they were going to Oregon, and her mother had no choice but to consent. Martha wrote, she begged father to give up the notion, but he could not. Mother finally reluctantly consented to go. Lovers, sweethearts, and associates were all left behind. The saddest parting of all was when my mother took leave of her aged and sorrowing mother, knowing full well that they would never meet again on earth. At least that woman had a husband to make the decisions, to drive the wagon, to handle the oxen. You do not even have that. So when you approach the wagon trains gathering at the jumping-off point, when you ask if you can join them, what do you think happens? The wagon captain looks at you like you just proposed swimming to the moon. Other women whisper behind their hands. Men shake their heads. You are a liability, you're a mouth to feed who cannot hunt. You're someone who will slow them down when your wagon breaks. You're a woman alone among dozens of men, and that makes everyone uncomfortable. But here is the thing about wagon trains. They were communities, and communities operate on a mix of practicality and compassion. And in 1849, there was still enough compassion left in most people that they would not leave a woman to die alone in Missouri. So eventually, reluctantly, someone agrees. Usually, it is an older couple, grandparent age, who remember what it is like to need help. Or a large family with teenage sons who can help with your wagon. Or sometimes, frankly, a single man who sees opportunity in your desperation. That last possibility should make you very, very nervous. But we will get to that later. For now, you are in. You're part of a wagon train of maybe 40 or 50 wagons representing perhaps 200 people. You have your wagon, which cost you 60. Mormonithan you have ever spent in anything in your life. You have your oxen thanatamopher, which costanatha 60. Mormonithan you have ever spent in anything in your life. You have your oxen tanata 120. You have 6 months worth of supplies, 200 pounds of flour, 150 pounds of bacon, 10 pounds of coffee, 20 pounds of sugar, 10 pounds of sugar, 10 pounds of salt. You have a rifle you do not really know how to shoot. You have a few changes of clothes, a Bible, maybe one other book if you were lucky. All of this cost you somewhere between 600 and 800. 20,000 today. Andy Warabettenjev Repenio Fitoni Rehabilitability. 2,000 miles san survive. The departure a dataset. April 20 1849. The grasses finale hyena for the oxen. Togres. Livetueli. Andia animal starve. Livetulate. Andia res getting caught in the mountain snows. The Timming Hasto be perfect. The night before you leave, Julienu Ragon listoning to Thessaun soft the camp. A baby creeing, Ammon coughing, summon a playing Gaffadel badly. Andio wonder, really wonder if yo will ever hear civilized sounds again. In the morning, the wagon captain fires his rifle. This time. The Wagenslurch Fordon Bion. The Oxenstran Agans. The Wagenslurch Fordon Bion. The Oxenstran Agans Stereox. The Wheel Screek and Groan. Andy War Walking. Always Walking. The Wagon Serfor Cargon Thesic. Every O'Neill's walks 15 miles Sade. The Thetis Thieverage for 6 months. You. Hand ser going to crack and a bleed from the coldantha rough work. You re going to cre yourself to sleep more nights than you can count bleed from the coldantha rough work. You re going to cre yourself to sleep more nights than you can count. Butrite no in this moment, as Independence, Missouri disappears behind you, and te vas prario pensupahid like an ocean of grass, you feel something unexpect. Ted. Opa, maybe you can beth you men what proves every own wrong. That feeling will not last long. Be wara stronger than an yon gave you credit for. Maybe you can beth you men what proves every own wrong. That feeling will not last long. Be you take for no fear life, you let yourself believe. Vevion legist begun this journey, and already I can feel few. I to fit, thame possibility, the Kirija took just to make it the decision Togo. Bathares what you need tono, that the hardest part is not the decision. The decision. The furt is what comes next. Because in 8 weeks, you re going to face a choice that will determine whether you levy ordi. The foys about economics, about survival, about what you ruling to sacrifice the Makato Oregon. Starts with a simple question. Can you then afford to survive? Stay with them. This is where it gets real. Money. Let's talk about money. It's no romantic. Tosent fit the picture way Havana heads of brav. Epionus conquering the wilderness through sheer grit and determination. Bathares the brutal truth that the history books often skip over. The Oregon derail was no gestate stuff courage. D28 stuff wealth. And for Reu, a woman alone with limite dress or son diven more limite dalgau right stothosoressa. CES. The economics of survival might kill you faster than Colariva could. So, let me skyer you something. Right no, in your real life could you come up with 20,000 dozen today. Andy worry betting every pen your fit on your ability 2,000 miles and survive. The departure a dataset Potter dataset T4 20,000 1849. The grasses finale hyena for the oxenta graze. Livetu early and your animal starve. Livetu let and your es getting caught in themaun. Tarnes knows. The timming has to be perfect. The night before you leave, you in your wagon listening to the sounds of the camp. A baby creeing, a manco ugging, Samona playing Gaffadel badly, undia wonder, real a wonder refia well of a here civilized sounds again the fia well of a sleeping aerial. iPad. If you well of a see another spring, in the morning. The wagon captain fire his rifle. It is time. The wagon sledge Ford and Bion. The Exenstren against stereo. S. The wheel screek and groan. Andy War walking. Always walking. The wagon Serfor Cargon Thesic. Every O'Neill's walks 15 miles a day. The tis Thieverage for 6 months. Your feet are going to bleed. Your legs are going to burn from the dust. Your hands are going to crack and bleed from theckle and the rough work. You're going to cre yourself. Or sleep more nights than you can count. Butrite noe. In this moment. As Independence, Missouri disappears behind you. Vas prario pensupahid like an ocean off. Ras, you feel something unexpected. Hope. Maybe, just maybe, you can is. Maybe wara stronger than onion gave you credit for. Maybe you can beth you men what proves sev iron wrong. That feeling will not last long. But for no. For the own shining moment at the beginning of the greatest gamble of your life, you let yourself believe. We only just begun this journey, and already I can feel your tefit, thame possibility, the Kira J took just a make their decision Togo. Bathares what you need tono. T. Hey hardest part is not their decision. The hardest part is what comes next. Because in 8 weeks, you re going to face a choice that will determine whether you levy ordi. A show. Ice about economics, about survival, about what you ruling to sacrifice to Makato Oregon. And that choice starts with a simple question. Can you even afford to survive? Stay with them. This is where it gets real. Money. Let's talk about money. It's no romantic. It doesn't fit. I a picture we have in our heads of brave pioneers conquering the wilderness through sheer grit and determination. Bathares the brutal truth that the history book softens. Kip over the Oregon Trail was not just state staff courage. It was 8 staff wealth. And for Reu, a woman alone with limite resource and even more limite dalga right status. Resources, the economics of survival might kill you faster than Colariva could. So, let me ask you something. Right now, in your real life, could you come up with 20,000 in cash, not credit, not a loan, actual money in hand? Because that's what you need. That's what this journey costs when you adjust 1849 money to modern terms. 600 to 600 to 800 in $1849. And you need it all up front before you even take your first step westward. Now, here's the part that should terrify you. You are a woman. And in 1849 in most states, women don't actually own anything. Not legally. If you are married, everything belongs to your husband. If you are single or widowed, you exist in this strange legal grey area where you can sort of own things, but you cannot vote, you cannot serve on a jury, you cannot sign most contracts, and good luck getting a bank to take you seriously. So how did you get the money for this wagon and these supplies? Maybe your husband left it to you before he died. Maybe you sold everything you owned, including your wedding ring. Maybe you borrowed from a male relative who will expect to be repaid in land or labor once you reach Oregon. Or maybe, and this is the darkest possibility, you made a deal with a man who is traveling with the wagon train. He pays your way, and in exchange, well, we both know what he expects in exchange. Let me break down exactly what your money bought you, because understanding this is crucial to understanding the impossible math of survival. 60. It skele de prarius huna, and it looks romantis in paintings with its white canvas bonnetarking over thewed and frame like hashipsal. Butape close. It is just a wooden box and wheels 10 feet long 4 feet wide, maybe 2 feet deep. That's your entire life no. Everything iauen has to fit in that box the fit, and in has to el than 2,000 pounds, oria oxen wildy from exhaustion. The accentum silvis area biggest expense. 4 of them, for j, machadas bust you could manage, cost about 60. It skele de prarius huna, and it looks romantis in paintings with its white canvas bonnetarking over thewed and from lekashipsale. Butape close. It's just a wooden box and wheels 10 feet long 4 feet wide, maybe 2 feet deep. That's your entire life no. Everything iauen has to fit in that box, and it still has to wiles. Than 2,000 pounds, oria oxen wildy from exhaustion. The oxentum selvus area biggest expense. 4 of them, machadas bust you could manage, cost about 30 or wagon costs each. 120 total, desenimalser urongen. Them. Without them, you are stranded. Thayer, more valuable thaniwara. Frankly, in the brutal calculus of that trail. Broknax. Lekan befix a dedex cannot. And you, as a woman who has progoblind worked with cattle in your life, havitolan tocomantes immersive beasts. Each on a way. Surround 2,000 pounds, that they are strong, they are steady, but they are also stubborn and not particularly bright. The sariason pi pluseth phrase basanox. The sinimals will walk off cliffs if you let them. They will drink themselves sick from alkaline water. They will defromlet or futsori or simplix hostio. And went dido. Ure going to have it to butcher themant decidi off detriland pray or can buy or trade for air placement at the next fort. And feeding them. That's a new 2. You ring today thegras as thy walk. At night. Jau have it to let them lusetagres amamo. Reach men so have it to fintemiganain the morning. Lost an ox because it wandered off during the night. Congratulations, you just lost a monswidges. And theriaria supplies. 200 pounds soft flour. 150 pounds soft back and packet in barrels of salt. Dreed beans C. Offie. Sugar, salt, mabissa midrid fruit if you could afford it, which you probably couldn't. Cooking equipment. A cast iron pot, a skillet, a duchavan, half-utin plate sand cups, matches carefully kept to dree, candles, soap, and weapons are fled definitely. Eventha you probably have no idea how to sat properly. May buy pistol, ammunition, gunpowder. You need this not just for protection but for hunting. The buffalo herd says still the plants in 1849. A fuke.
And shootdown, that's fresh meat for days if you cannot.
Well, you better hope some yonil sanya wagon trent expitioni wanches. Alof disadsup fast. Virafast. Anteres thing no bad at all. Else I wabati Oregon Trail. The Thanichial investment is just the beginning. This is not anti meek expense. This is expense of fungo in costs. Trad. Ing post start appearing along the trail around Fort Kearney, Nebraska. By the team you ghetto Fort Laramie. Dasai Wyoming. You read the mercy of ever is running the supplied potter. Antinoitat tata, thainoe dat fure tata, sotha charge you het verthi want.
120 total, the senimal surianjan. Without them, you are stranded. Theamorvalio belthaniwara, frankly, in the brutal calculus of that trail, de broknax. Lecanbefix. A dedax cannot. Undue, as a woman who has probablind worked with cattle in your life, have a talento command to semasive beasts. Each on your way. Surround 2,000 pounds. The thea strong. Thea steady, but thea sos to burn and nat particularly bright. The sarias on p pluseth phrase basanox. The sinimals will walk off cliffs if you let them. They will drink themselves sick from alkaline waiter. They well from bloat or foot sorry or simplix hostio. And one thido, uregoing to have it a butcher theme and thesidoff that triland prayo can buy or trade for air placement at the next fort. And feeding them. That's a new third tot night try you have it to let them lucetta graze a memo. Re ja Congratulations, you just lost a month's wages. In theory I are supplement list. 200 pounds soft flour.
Waffy, sugar, salt, mabissum dreadfoot if you could afford it, which you probably couldn't. Cooking equipment, a cast iron pot, a skillet, a duchovan. AF Uten plate sand cups, matches carefully kept tree candles, soapy and weapons are fled definitely, eventho you probably have noidi how to say it properly.
Anshutone, that's fresh meat for days, if you cannot.
Well, you better hope so may on il sanya wagon train expedition one shares dat aloft this ad subfast, varifast dat an arrest the thing nobodital. Else I about the Oregon Trail the financial investment is just the beginning. This is no county me expense. This is expensive and going costs. Trading post appearing along the trail around Fort Kearney, Nebraska. By the time you get to Fort Laramie, Wyoming, you read the mercy of forever. Is running the supplied potter. Anthinoid tot thanoeo canotten back. Thanoe ware desperate. Sotha charge your head verthi want. 16 to cross the Green River on a ferry. 16 thats marethan half the cost of furla takrasariva that maboyo could have forded yourself. But the ferry prat or looks at you. Sisa woman alone and knows you're too scared toriskit. So you pay or you trade a blanket as a flour. Whatever you can spare. Witches never lie anything you can spare. And it's not just the rivers. Everything costs more outher. A ein wagon wheel. 16 that's more than half the cost of fire wagon just to float across our river that my bio could have forded yourself. But tifferio prat or looks at you. Sees a woman alone and knows you're too scared toriskit. So you pay. Or you trade a blanket as a flour. Whatever you can spare, which is never really anything you can spare. And it's not just the rivers. Everything costs more there. A new wagon wheel. 30 if you can find one. A replacement ox. 40, maybe 50, medicine, tools, even basic repairs. Everything is inflated because supply is scarce and demand is desperate. Here's something that I think really captures the cruelty of the economics. Back in Missouri, before you left, you probably overpacked. Everyone does. You brought your good dishes, maybe a rocking chair that belonged to your grandmother, some books, extra clothes, things that meant something, things that connected you to the life you were leaving behind. Within the first month, you will throw half of it away. The trail is littered with abandoned possessions, furniture left beside the road because the wagon is too heavy, heirlooms buried in shallow graves because there's no room and every pound matters. People joke darkly that you could follow the Oregon Trail just by following the trail of discarded pianos. Rich families actually brought pianos. Can you imagine? And then they had to watch as their most valuable possession was left behind to rot in the rain because the oxen were dying. You cannot afford those mistakes. You don't have a piano to throw away. You don't have excess anything. Every item in your wagon was chosen because it is essential, and you're still probably going to run out of something crucial. But let's talk about the real economic trap, the one that catches women specifically, the one that makes me angry even thinking about it across more than 170 years. The Donation Land Act of 1850. You know about this, right? This is the big draw. This is why people are risking everything to get to Oregon. Free land. The government is giving away land to settlers. Married couples get 640 acres. That's a full section, a square mile of earth. It's an impossible fortune for people who could never afford land back east. Single men get 320 acres, half as much, but still 320 acres of free land. And single women, widows like you, nothing. Zero, not 1 acre. Well, that's not quite true. The law says unmarried settlers can claim 160 acres. But here's the catch. That means unmarried men. Women who never married might technically qualify, but widows? The law is murky. Some clerks interpret it one way, some another. It depends on who you talk to, what mood they are in, how sympathetic they are to your situation. And even if you do somehow qualify for those 160 acres, how are you going to work them? You need equipment, you need seed, you need tools, you need labor. And you are one woman alone, probably in your 20s, with no money left after spending everything on the journey. This is why remarriage was not just common for widows on the trail. It was survival. Let me tell you about Matilda Sager. We talked about the Sager children before, those orphans who were adopted by the Whitmans. Matilda was one of them. She married at 15, barely more than a child herself. She and her husband Louis moved to California, and for a few years they did well. They had cattle, they had land, they were building something. Then the winter of 1862 hit, one of the worst winters California had ever seen. Their cattle died, hundreds of them. Their fortune, their future frozen in the fields. And then Louis got sick, cancer. He fought it for 3 years while they watched everything they had worked for crumble. He died in the spring of 1865. Matilda was 24 years old. She had 5 children. She had 75 head of cattle left, a small piece of land,
a garden, and an orchard. That's it. That's what she had to keep 6 people alive. So what did she do? She took in laundry. Can you picture it? Washing other people's clothes in ice-cold water, her hands raw and bleeding, because that was the only work available to a woman in her position. And she survived. She raised those kids, and eventually she married again. She married Matthew Haslett, who had been a partner of her first husband, someone who knew the situation and was willing to step into it. That marriage gave her stability, protection, a legal identity that allowed her to own property and make decisions. It was not necessarily about love, although maybe it grew into that. It was about survival. Do you see the trap, the economic trap that women were caught in? You could make it to Oregon. You could survive the journey, you could be strong and capable and brave, and none of it mattered if you could not legally own land, could not access credit, could not function as an independent economic actor. The system was designed to force women into marriage or into dependence on male relatives or into poverty. And here's the thing that really gets me, the thing that makes this personal for me. Even though I am sitting here in 2025, safe and comfortable and able to own property and have a credit card in my own name, the thing that makes me angry on behalf of all those women who had no choice. They were not weak, they were not helpless, they were not any less capable than the men around them. When husbands died, women drove wagons. When wagon trains lost their men, women kept going. In 1852, Ezra Meeker saw those 11 wagons driven by women trying to get back to the east. They made it to Fort Laramie. That's more than halfway across the continent. They did that. Women did that. But the law said they could not own land. The law said they needed a man's protection. The law said they were property, essentially, passing from father to husband to son. So when you are standing there in Independence, Missouri, counting your money, knowing it is barely enough, knowing that even if you make it to Oregon, you might not be able to claim land, what are your options? You could turn around, give up, admit defeat before you even start. But turn around to what? You have no home anymore. You sold everything. Your family, if you have any left, probably cannot or will not take you in. You are a burden, a failed venture. You could marry quickly. Find a man in the wagon train who needs a wife. Make a practical arrangement. Lots of women did this. Marriages happened on the trail all the time. Quick, practical unions between people who barely knew each other but understood that they were stronger together than apart. Sometimes these marriages worked out, sometimes they did not. But they were survival strategies, not romance. Or you could gamble everything on reaching Oregon and figuring it out when you get there. Maybe you will find work. Maybe you will meet someone. Maybe you will manage to claim land through some loophole or sympathetic official. Maybe. There is a woman I read about named Lucinda Brown. She traveled the Oregon Trail, and 170 years later, one of her descendants saw a kettle from her journey for the first time in a museum. Just a kettle, a piece of cooking equipment, but it survived. It made the journey and lasted long enough to become history. I wonder about Lucinda sometimes. I wonder what she sacrificed to keep that kettle, what else she had to leave behind so that one piece of her old life could come with her to the new one. I wonder if she traveled alone or with family or with a new husband she barely knew. I wonder if she looked at that kettle sometimes during the journey and thought about the kitchen it used to live in, the home it represented, the life that was gone forever. These are the calculations you're making. Not just can I survive the journey, but can I afford to survive the destination? Not just will I make it to Oregon, but what will I become in order to get there? And the answer for most women involved compromise, involved surrender, involved accepting that independence was not really an option no matter how strong or capable you were. That is the economic reality of the Oregon Trail for a woman alone. It is not just about money. It is about power, about who has it and who does not, about how the entire system was designed to keep women dependent and vulnerable. But you know what? Some women made it anyway. Some women found ways to survive without surrendering everything. Some women got to Oregon and built lives on their own terms, or at least on terms they could live with. The question is, are you going to be one of them? Because right now, standing at the beginning of this journey, the money in your pocket is already running low. The first 100 miles are behind you. The Kansas prairie stretches ahead, flat and endless and deceptively gentle. It will not stay gentle, and very soon you're going to face the first real test. But a physical one, the kind that separates the survivors from the graves. You're about to learn what it really means to walk 15 miles a day every day for months. You're about to discover what your body is capable of and what it is not. Stay close. This is where the trail stops being theoretical and starts being real. It is May 3rd, 1849. You've been walking for 13 days. Your feet have blisters on top of blisters. There is dust in your hair, in your eyes, in your mouth, ground so deep into the fabric of your dress that it will never come out. Your shoulders ache from the constant motion of walking, from the nights spent sleeping on the hard ground with nothing but a thin blanket between you and the earth. And you still have 1,870 miles to go. Welcome to the reality of the Oregon Trail. This is what nobody talks about when they romanticize westward expansion. Not the dramatic moments, not the river crossings or the mountain passes or the encounters with wildlife. Just the endless, grinding, soul-crushing monotony of walking and walking 15 miles a day. That is the average. Some days you make 20 if the trail is good and the weather holds. Some days you make 5 because someone's wagon broke down, or an ox is footsore, or it rained, and the whole world turned to mud. But the average, day after day after day, is 15 miles. Do you know how long it takes to walk 15 miles? About 5 hours if you're on a paved road with good shoes and you can maintain a steady pace. On the Oregon Trail, try 7 or 8 hours. Because you're not on a paved road, you're following ruts worn into the prairie by the wagons that came before you. Sometimes those ruts are so deep that wagons get stuck in them like trains on a track. Sometimes the trail just disappears, and you have to navigate by landmarks and hope you're heading in the right direction. And you are not just walking, you are working, constantly working. Let me walk you through a typical day, because I think this is where the true horror of the trail becomes real. Not in the big disasters, but in the daily grind. You wake up before sunrise, not because you want to, but because if you don't get moving early, you won't make your miles before dark. The wagon captain will fire his rifle to wake the camp. That sound every morning, sharp and jarring, pulling you out of whatever fitful sleep you manage to find. Your first job is to start a fire. And this right here is going to be one of the strangest adjustments of your new life. Back home, you had a kitchen, you had a stove, you had walls and a roof, and wood that stayed dry. Out here, you have whatever you can find. The first few weeks crossing Missouri and Kansas, there are still trees. You can gather fallen branches, scraps of bark, anything that will burn. But even then, if it rained during the night, everything is wet. Starting a fire with wet wood when you have never done it before in your life. Good luck. And it only gets worse. Once you hit the Great Plains, the trees disappear. Just gone. Nothing but grass stretching to the horizon in every direction. So, what do you burn? Buffalo chips. I'm not going to sugarcoat this. Buffalo dung. Dried, yes, but still dung. The buffalo herds that roam the plains leave behind millions of these flat, disc-shaped droppings that dry in the sun, and they burn. They burn hot and clean, and they are the only fuel source for hundreds of miles. Your first time picking up buffalo chips, you probably wore gloves, held them at arm's length, wrinkled your nose in disgust. By week 3, you're just tossing them into a basket like you are gathering eggs. You have bigger problems to worry about than the indignity of handling animal waste. So you get your fire started. Then you need water. If you're lucky, you camp near a stream or a spring. If you are not lucky, someone has to walk half a mile to the nearest water source and haul it back. Water is heavy. A bucket of water weighs about 20 pounds. You need water for cooking, for washing, for the oxen. Lots of water. And every drop has to be carried. Then you cook breakfast. Bacon if you have it. Biscuits made from flour mixed with water and a pinch of salt, cooked in a skillet over the fire. Coffee, which is more important than food because it's the only thing keeping you sane. Maybe some beans that you soaked overnight. While you're doing this, the men are yoking the oxen, catching them first because they were turned loose to graze during the night. Then fitting the heavy wooden yokes over their necks, checking the leather straps, making sure everything is secure. This is skilled work. It takes practice and strength and a certain amount of patience because oxen are not exactly cooperative animals. But here's the thing, you are a woman alone, so you have to do both. You have to cook your breakfast and yoke your own oxen. And you have to do it fast because the wagon train is not going to wait for you. By 7 o'clock in the morning, you are moving. The wagons form a line, single file usually, sometimes 2 or 3 abreast if the trail is wide enough. You walk beside your wagon, not in it. The wagon is for supplies. Remember, only the sick and the very young ride. Everyone else walks, and you walk through the morning as the sun climbs higher and the heat starts to build, through the midday when the sun is directly overhead and there is no shade anywhere, and the dust kicked up by 200 oxen and 50 wagons hangs in the air like fog, through the afternoon when your feet are screaming and your mouth is so dry you cannot swallow, and you start to wonder if Oregon is even real, or if it's just a lie someone made up to torture people. There is a diary entry from a woman named Lydia Allen Rudd that has always stuck with me. She wrote, "Toiled on through the heat and dust, seeing nothing but the endless prairie. It is a lonely, wearisome journey. Lonely even though you're surrounded by people, even though there are dozens of families in your wagon train, because loneliness is not about being alone. It is about being disconnected, and you are so disconnected from everything you have ever known that you might as well be on another planet. The women you are traveling with, they are polite. Some are even kind, but you are an outsider. You don't fit into their family units. You cannot join in when they talk about their husbands or their plans for the farm they will build together. You're a reminder of what they could lose, a reminder that death is walking alongside this wagon train, and it could take their husbands just as easily as it took yours. So you walk in silence mostly, thinking, remembering, trying not to remember, counting your steps sometimes just to have something to focus on other than the pain. Around noon, the wagon train stops. Not for long, maybe an hour, maybe less. You have to make your miles. This is when you eat whatever you prepared that morning. Cold bacon, leftover biscuits. You water the oxen. You check your wagon for any problems, a loose wheel, a crack in the axle, anything that might become a disaster later. And then you walk again, all afternoon, until the sun starts to sink and the wagon captain finds a suitable place to camp, usually near water if possible. In a spot with enough grass for the oxen to graze, defensible, though not because of what you might think. Most wagon trains circled their wagons at night, yes, but not primarily to defend against attack. It was to create a corral for the animals, a barrier to keep the oxen and horses and mules from wandering off. Then the whole process starts over in reverse. Unhitch the oxen, turn them loose to graze, start a fire, cook dinner. Mend anything that broke during the day.
Wash clothes if you have the energy, which you probably don't. Most nights you're too tired to do anything but collapse.
Let me tell you something about the clothes washing, because this is one of those details that really drives home how hard this journey was for women specifically. Back home, laundry was already one of the most labor-intensive chores. You heated water, you scrubbed clothes against a washboard, you wrung them out by hand, you hung them to dry. It took an entire day, usually Monday, which was why it was called wash day. On the trail, you don't have a washboard, you don't have a clothesline, you don't have a day to dedicate to laundry. So you kneel by a stream, if there is a stream, and you scrub your clothes against rocks. The water is often muddy. You have to let it settle first, which means you have to wait. And the clothes never really get clean, they just get less filthy. And here is the worst part. You cannot undress to wash yourself properly. There is no privacy, nowhere to hide. So you stay in your clothes day after day until they are stiff with sweat and dust, and you cannot remember what it feels like to be clean. This is what breaks people. Not the big dramatic disasters, but the daily accumulation of small miseries, the blisters, the exhaustion, the dirt, the loneliness, the absolute lack of comfort or rest or relief. But you know what? You're tougher than you thought. We all are. Humans are incredibly adaptable. After a few weeks, you stop noticing the dust as much. Your feet develop calluses. Your muscles, screaming in protest at first, gradually strengthen. You learn the rhythm of the trail. You learn which sounds mean danger and which sounds are normal. You learn how to coax your oxen forward when they balk. You learn how to start a fire in the wind. You learn, bit by bit, how to survive. There is a woman named Miriam Thompson Tuller who later wrote about her experience on the trail. Unlike most women who dreaded the journey, Miriam was excited. She wrote, "I was possessed with a spirit of adventure and a desire to see what was new and strange." I love that, a spirit of adventure. In the midst of all this hardship, some women found joy. They found beauty in the prairie sunsets. They found friendship with other women in the wagon train. They found pride in their own capability, in discovering they were stronger than they ever imagined. Maybe you are finding that too. Maybe after 2 weeks of walking, you are starting to believe you can do this. Maybe you looked at yourself this morning, really looked, and saw someone different than the person who left Independence. Sunburned, dusty, exhausted, but still standing, still walking, still here. That is something. That is worth celebrating. But here is what you need to know. What I need to tell you before you get too comfortable. The first 500 miles through Kansas and Nebraska. This is the easy part. The trail here is well established. The grass is good. The water is usually safe to drink. The weather in May and June is generally mild. You have covered maybe a quarter of the journey, and you have not yet faced the thing that killed more pioneers than anything else. More than accidents, more than starvation, more than violence. Disease. Cholera specifically, the invisible killer. The terror that turned healthy people into corpses in less than 24 hours. The disease that left the Oregon Trail looking like a graveyard, with graves every 100 yards. Bodies buried in the trail itself so that wagon wheels would pack down the earth and keep animals from digging them up. You've been lucky so far. Your wagon train has stayed healthy. But as you push deeper into Nebraska, as you encounter other wagon trains and share campsites and water sources, your luck is about to change. Someone in your camp is going to get sick, and when they do, you are going to have to make a choice. A choice about compassion versus survival, about staying to help or leaving them behind.
about what kind of person you are willing to become in order to live. That choice is coming soon, sooner than you think, and it is going to haunt you for the rest of your life, no matter what you decide. But we are not there yet. Right now, in this moment, you're still walking through the golden prairie of eastern Nebraska. The sun is setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink and purple that you never saw back home. The air is cooling. Your wagon is rattling along behind you. Your oxen are plodding steadily forward. And for just this one moment, maybe you let yourself feel something close to peace. Hold on to that feeling. You're going to need it for what comes next. The child dies on a Tuesday morning in late June. You don't know her name. She's maybe 4 years old, with blonde curls that her mother braided every morning before the wagon train started moving. You have watched that ritual for weeks now. The mother, patient and gentle, weaving those little braids while the girl squirmed and giggled. Yesterday morning, the girl was too weak to squirm. This morning, she is gone. They bury her before noon. They have to in this heat. They cannot wait. Her father digs the grave in the middle of the trail, right where the wagons will roll over it, packing down the earth. Her mother wraps her in a quilt, the only one they have left, and places her in the ground. There is no coffin, no marker, no time for a proper funeral. The wagon captain is already shouting to move out. You watch the mother's face as they cover her daughter with dirt. She's not crying. She is beyond crying. She just stands there empty, as if her soul has been buried along with her child. And then she climbs into her wagon, and the train moves forward, and by afternoon you cannot even tell where the grave was. This is cholera. This is the thing that killed more people on the Oregon Trail than every other cause combined. And it is coming for your wagon train. Let me explain something about cholera that I think gets lost in the history books. We know about it now. We understand it is caused by bacteria in contaminated water. We have treatments, antibiotics, rehydration therapy. We can save people, but in 1849 nobody knows what causes it. Nobody knows how to stop it. It is just this mysterious, terrifying plague that appears without warning and kills with brutal efficiency. You wake up feeling fine, maybe a little queasy, but you blame it on the bacon that tasted off last night. By mid-morning you have violent diarrhea. By noon you cannot keep water down. Your body is expelling fluids faster than you can replace them. You're cramping, vomiting, your skin turning grayish-blue from dehydration. And by evening, if you are unlucky, you are dead. Less than 12 hours from healthy to corpse. That is how fast cholera works. The numbers are staggering. Historians estimate that in 1849 alone, which just happens to be your year on the trail, thousands of people died from cholera. Thousands. In the worst stretches of trail through Kansas and Nebraska, there were graves every 100 yards. Every single 100 yards. Do the math on that. 2,000 miles of trail. That's over 100,000 yards, over 1,000 graves visible from the trail, and many more that were hidden or left unmarked. The Oregon Trail became the longest graveyard in American history. 10 to 15 deaths per mile, averaged out over 3 decades of migration. But 1849 was special. 1849 was the year cholera hit the United States in its first major epidemic, and it hit the Oregon Trail like a tsunami. Here is what it feels like to be in a wagon train during a cholera outbreak. Every morning when you wake up, you check yourself. How do I feel? Is my stomach upset? Am I dizzy? Every little twinge of discomfort becomes a potential death sentence. You watch everyone around you with suspicion and fear. That man who looks pale, is he sick? That child who is not eating, is it starting? You become obsessed with water. Where is it coming from? Is it clean? But how can you tell if water is clean? It looks the same whether it is safe or deadly. Some people think the disease comes from bad air. Some think it is God's judgment. Some think it spreads through touch. Nobody agrees because nobody actually knows. So you do the only thing you can do. You boil your water, even though nobody's quite sure if that helps. You avoid sick people, even though that means abandoning them to die alone. And you pray. You pray constantly, desperately, making bargains with God that you probably cannot keep. There is a diary entry from a woman named Cecilia Adams that absolutely breaks my heart. She was traveling in 1852, 3 years after your journey, but cholera was still ravaging the trail. She wrote, "It is a melancholy thought to reflect on the mothers and wives who have left their loved ones on the desolate plains, and they know not where they are buried. They know not where they are buried because there was no time to mark graves properly, no time to build fences or place stones. You dug a hole, you put your loved one in it, you covered them up, and you moved on. And within days, wind and rain and animals erased all evidence that they had ever existed. This is psychological torture. Grief is hard enough, but grief without closure, grief without even knowing exactly where your husband or child or mother is resting, that is a special kind of hell." Let me tell you about a specific incident that was recorded by multiple diarists, so we know it really happened. There was a wagon train in the summer of 1849 traveling through what is now central Nebraska when cholera struck hard. Within 3 days, they lost 12 people. 12 people from a train of maybe 40 wagons. That's almost one person per family. The survivors panicked. Some families broke away from the train trying to outrun the disease. Others stayed but moved their wagons as far apart as possible, refusing to share water or supplies. The social bonds that held the wagon train together just disintegrated under the terror of invisible death. And here is the thing that haunts me, the thing that makes me wonder what I would have done in that situation. Several families had members who were showing symptoms but were not dead yet, just weak, just starting to get sick. And the wagon captain made a decision. He said the train could not wait, could not stop. Anyone who was too sick to travel would have to be left behind. Left behind to die alone on the prairie with maybe a blanket and a canteen of water if they were lucky. Some families made the choice to stay with their sick loved ones. They pulled their wagons out of the line and watched the rest of the train disappear into the distance. Most of those people never made it to Oregon. They died there on the plains, and we don't even know their names. But some families made the other choice. They left their sick behind. A husband left his wife. A mother left her child, because the alternative was for the whole family to die. What do you do with that? How do you live with yourself after making that choice? How do you sleep at night knowing you left someone you loved to die alone because you wanted to survive? I don't have an answer to that. I don't think there is a good answer. It is just one of those impossible situations where every choice is wrong, and you have to pick the least wrong option, and then carry the guilt forever. Now imagine you're in the middle of this outbreak. You are a woman alone, traveling with a wagon train that is barely holding together under the strain of disease and fear. What is your position in this hierarchy of survival? Not good at all. You have no family to protect you, no husband to speak for you, no children to care for. If you get sick, who's going to stop the train for you? Who's going to nurse you back to health, assuming you can even recover? Nobody. That's who. You are expendable. But here is the flip side. Here is the strange, dark advantage of being alone. You also have nobody to mourn. If the disease takes someone from the family you've been traveling near, someone you've grown fond of, you can grieve. But you don't have to watch your own child die. You don't have to bury your own husband. You are carrying your own fear, but not the fear for someone else. I'm not sure if that is better or worse. I think it might be both. Let me talk for a minute about the physical reality of cholera, because understanding what is happening to the body makes the terror more real. Cholera is caused by a bacterium called Vibrio cholerae. It lives in water contaminated by human waste. When you drink that water, the bacteria colonize your intestines and produce a toxin that causes massive fluid loss. Your body is literally leaking to death. You can lose up to a quarter of your body's fluid per hour through diarrhea and vomiting. Your eyes sink back into your skull. Your skin loses elasticity and turns blue-gray. Your pulse becomes weak and rapid. You're cold, cramping, desperately thirsty, but unable to keep down water. The treatment, if there were treatment, would be simple. Rehydration. Replacing the fluids and electrolytes you're losing. But in 1849, nobody understands this. The medical knowledge of the time actually makes things worse. Doctors believe in heroic medicine. They bleed patients thinking that will remove the bad humors. They give them calomel, which is mercury chloride, which is literally poison. They do everything except the one thing that might actually help. So people die. They die in agony, surrounded by family who can do nothing but watch. Or they die alone, abandoned on the trail because the wagon train could not stop. There is a particularly cruel aspect of cholera that I need to mention. It does not discriminate. Wealth does not protect you. Strength does not protect you. Youth does not protect you. The disease kills rich and poor, strong and weak, old and young with equal efficiency. The only thing that matters is whether you drank contaminated water. And since everyone on the trail is drinking from the same rivers and streams, everyone is at risk all the time for 6 months. Can you imagine living like that? Can you imagine the constant low-level terror? Every time you take a sip of water, you are gambling with your life. Every time you wake up in the morning feeling fine, you're grateful because it means you survived another night. And every time someone else gets sick, you are relieved it is not you. And then you hate yourself for feeling relieved. This is what I mean when I say the Oregon Trail was not an adventure. It was not romantic. It was a sustained trauma that lasted for months and changed everyone who experienced it. There is a concept in psychology called moral injury. It is different from PTSD. PTSD is about fear and helplessness. Moral injury is about being forced to violate your own ethical code, about doing things that go against everything you believe is right and good, and then having to live with those actions forever. The Oregon Trail caused massive moral injury. People had to make choices that destroyed them internally. They had to abandon sick friends. They had to steal from other wagons when their own supplies ran out. They had to watch children die and keep walking. They had to become people they never wanted to be just to survive. And you, right now in June of 1849, are about to face your own moral injury. Because here is what is happening. A woman in your wagon train is sick, not the mother who lost her child, a different woman. Her name is Sarah. She is 32 years old. She's been kind to you. She shared her coffee when yours ran out. She taught you how to make better biscuits over an open fire. She's married with 3 young children and she is dying. Her husband is desperate. He knows that if he stops to nurse her, his whole family might die. The children need to get to Oregon. They need land and a future. But he cannot bear the thought of leaving her. He comes to you late at night and he asks for help. He asks if you will stay with his wife while he takes the children ahead with the wagon train. Just for a few days, just until she recovers, or doesn't. He will leave supplies. He will come back for you both. He promises he will not abandon you. What do you say? Do you trust his promise? Do you risk your own life to help a dying woman? Do you have medical knowledge that might actually help? Or would you just be keeping her company while she dies? And here is the darker question, the one nobody wants to ask, but everyone is thinking. If you stay and she dies, will the wagon train actually wait for you? Or will you be stranded alone, hundreds of miles from anywhere, with a corpse and a promise that might not be kept? This is not hypothetical. Situations like this happened constantly. Women were left to care for the sick because caregiving was women's work. And sometimes those women never caught back up to their wagon trains. Sometimes they died alongside the people they were trying to save. Sometimes they survived but had to join a different train or make desperate deals with strangers or turn back entirely. What would you do? Really, truly, what would you do? I think about this a lot. I think about the courage it took to say yes in that situation, to risk everything for compassion. And I also think about the survival instinct that made people say no, because both answers are valid, both answers are human. The Oregon Trail did not have heroes and villains. It just had scared people trying to make impossible choices with incomplete information and no good options. Right now, standing in the darkness, listening to Sarah's labored breathing from the wagon where she lies, you have to choose. Your answer will define not just your immediate future, but the kind of person you become. The story you tell yourself about yourself for the rest of your life. Whatever you choose, you're going to have to live with it. And out here on the trail, where death is commonplace and judgment is harsh, living with your choices might be harder than dying. But we're not going to dwell in this darkness. Not tonight, because there is something ahead that offers hope. A landmark, a destination, a place where you can rest and resupply and gather your strength for the second half of this brutal journey. Fort Laramie is waiting, and when you reach it, you're going to have to make another decision. One that is just as important, just as final as the choice you're making right now. Keep going, we're getting to the good part. The part where you discover just how strong you really are. There is a sound you learn to fear on the Oregon Trail. It is not the crack of thunder or the howl of wolves or even the moans of the sick. It is the sound of rushing water, because water more than anything else is what separates the living from the dead. You hear it now in early July as your wagon train crests a small rise and suddenly the landscape opens up before you. The Platte River, a mile wide and an inch deep, they say. Except right now, fed by mountain snowmelt and summer storms, it is not an inch deep. It is 3 feet deep in some places, 4 feet in others, and it is moving fast, carrying tree branches and debris, churning with mud and power. Someone in your wagon train mutters a prayer. Someone else just stares, face gone pale. Because this is it. This is the gamble. Cross successfully and you continue toward Oregon. Fail and you drown, or you lose your wagon, or you lose your oxen, or all three. Welcome to the deadliest challenge on the Oregon Trail. Not disease, not starvation, not attacks. Rivers. Plain, simple, unavoidable rivers that had to be crossed because there was no way around them. And those rivers killed more families than you can imagine. Let me give you some numbers that honestly make me sick to think about. The Green River alone, which you will not reach for another month, killed 37 people in a single summer. 37. Just one river. There were dozens of major river crossings on the Oregon Trail. The Kansas River, the Platte River, which you have to cross multiple times, the North Platte, the Sweetwater, the Snake River, the Columbia River, each one a potential death sentence. And here is what makes it worse. Nobody teaches you how to cross a river in a wagon. There is no manual, no expert guide, just advice from people who survived their own crossings. And that advice is often contradictory or outdated or just plain wrong. Because every river is different and conditions change daily. So you stand on the bank of the Platte River and you try to figure out if this is going to kill you. Question is always, do we ford it or do we pay for a ferry? And that question is never simple because it is really asking, do we risk our lives or do we risk our money? And for you, a woman alone with limited funds and no income, the money question is just as dangerous as the river. Let me tell you about the ferries. They started appearing along the trail in the late 1840s, set up by enterprising men who saw an opportunity. Build a raft, charge desperate immigrants, make a fortune. And they did make fortunes. The ferry at the Green River charged 16 per wagon. 16 per wagon. 16. Remember, that's a significant chunk of your total budget. Some ferries charged even more, depending on how desperate people were and how high the water was running. But at least ferries were safer, right? Well, no, not always. Ferries were basically just logs lashed together with ropes. They were powered by men with poles or by the current itself. They could capsize. They could come apart mid-river. They could be overloaded by greedy operators who cared more about profit than safety. There is a recorded incident from 1850 where a ferry on the North Platte River was so overloaded that it started sinking halfway across. The operators told everyone to jump into the water and swim. Some people made it, some did not. The wagon sank, taking all the family's possessions with it. The oxen, still yoked together, drowned in a tangle of harnesses and panic. Can you imagine watching that happen? Watching a family lose everything in 30 seconds because someone was greedy? So, the ferry is not guaranteed safety. It is just slightly better odds in exchange for money you can barely afford to spend. Which brings us back to fording, crossing on your own. Here is what you have to assess, standing on that riverbank. First, the depth. How deep is it really? The Platte is famous for being deceptive. It looks shallow because it is so wide, but there are channels, deep channels carved by the current, where a wagon can drop suddenly and flood. You need to find someone who has crossed before, or someone brave enough to wade in and test the depth with a long pole. Second, the current. How fast is the water moving? If it is too fast, it will push your wagon sideways. It will knock your oxen off their feet. It will sweep you downstream where the bottom might be rocks or quicksand or deep holes. You need to watch the surface. See where the water is smooth and where it is choppy. Choppy means obstacles. Smooth might mean deep. Third, the bottom. What are you going to be rolling over? Sand, gravel, mud. Quicksand was a real danger on the Platte. Your wagon wheels could sink into the riverbed and stick, and the more the oxen struggled, the deeper you would sink. People lost entire wagons to quicksand, just swallowed up by the river, gone. And fourth, the most important question of all, do you trust yourself to do this? Because you are a woman in 1849, and nobody expects you to know how to drive a team through a raging river. Nobody taught you. Nobody prepared you. But if you are traveling alone, nobody else is going to do it for you. Let me walk you through what a river crossing actually looks like, step by step, because I think understanding the mechanics makes the terror more real. First, you have to prepare your wagon. Everything inside needs to be secured or raised. Water is going to come in. That is guaranteed. So you take your most valuable items, your food supplies, anything that cannot get wet, and you pile them on top of other things. You try to create a dry space up high. Some people actually called their wagons, sealing the gaps between boards with tar or cloth to make them more waterproof. But most people did not have the time or materials, so they just accepted that everything was going to get soaked. Second, you have to manage your oxen. Oxen are strong, but they are not smart. They panic in deep water. They try to turn around and go back. Your job is to keep them moving forward, straight across, no matter what. You do this by walking alongside them if the water is shallow enough, shouting commands, using your whip if necessary. If the water is too deep to walk, you have to ride in the wagon and control them from there, which is nearly impossible when you cannot see them and the wagon is rocking and water is pouring in around your feet. Third, timing. You cannot cross alone. You need other wagons crossing at the same time, upstream from you, to break the current. You need to position yourself in the middle of the line if possible. Let someone else test the route. Follow their tracks. Hope they chose correctly. And then you just do it. You drive your oxen into the water. You feel the wagon bed shift as the wheels leave solid ground and start rolling through mud and current. You feel the whole structure shudder and sway. Water pours over the tongue of the wagon, over the yoke, soaking the oxen. They bellow and strain. The wagon lists to one side. For a horrible moment, you think it is going to tip over completely, and you brace yourself to jump, to swim, to survive. But it rights itself. The oxen find their footing. The wheels roll forward, inch by inch, fighting the current. You're halfway across, then 3/4, and then suddenly, blessedly, the front wheels hit the far bank, and you're pulling yourself up out of the water and onto dry land. You made it. Your wagon is intact, your supplies are soaked but salvageable. You did it, except not everyone does. Not everyone makes it. There is a diary entry from a man named Enoch Conyers who crossed the Platte in 1852. He watched a wagon in front of him hit a hole. The wagon tipped sideways. A woman and her baby were thrown into the water. Enoch wrote, "The woman was holding her baby above her head, trying to keep it safe, even as she went under. We pulled them out, but the baby was already gone. Already gone, drowned in the time it took to tip a wagon and pull someone out. That is how fast it happens. That is how little margin for error there is. And here is something I need you to understand. When someone drowned during a river crossing, there was often nobody to bury. The current took them, swept them away. Days later, maybe someone would find a body washed up on a sandbar miles downstream. Or maybe they would never find it at all, just gone, erased. How do you mourn someone when there is no grave, when you don't even know where they ended up? You just keep walking and try not to think about it. Try not to imagine them cold and alone in the river. Try not to hear their voice in the water sounds at night. This is the psychological weight of river crossings. It's not just the physical danger. It's the knowledge that if something goes wrong, you might lose people you love and never even have the chance to say goodbye. Never have a place to visit. Never have closure. Now, let me tell you what makes this even harder for you as a woman traveling alone. You don't have a partner to help make decisions. You don't have someone to wade into the river and test the depth while you hold the oxen. You don't have someone to ride in the wagon and steer while you walk alongside and guide the team. You don't have backup if something goes wrong. What you have is the kindness of strangers. Maybe, if they feel like helping, if they have time, if they are not too busy with their own families and their own crossings. So you have to ask for help. You have to approach the wagon captain or one of the other men and explain that you need assistance. And you have to hope they say yes. Because if they say no, if they decide you're too much trouble or too much risk, you are stuck. You either cross alone, which is almost certainly fatal, or you wait. Wait for another wagon train. Wait for better conditions. Wait and watch your supplies dwindle and your window for reaching Oregon before winter shrink. There is actually a recorded case from 1849, your exact year, of a woman who was traveling alone after her husband died from cholera. She reached the Platte River and asked for help crossing. The wagon captain said no. He said she was slowing them down and we could not afford the delay. So she waited. For 3 days she camped on that riverbank, watching other wagon trains pass, asking each one for help. Finally, a train led by a Methodist minister agreed to take her. They helped her cross. They let her join their group for the rest of the journey. She made it to Oregon. But those 3 days of waiting alone, watching the water rise and fall, wondering if anyone would ever help, I cannot imagine the despair. And here is the thing that really gets me. Men could cross rivers alone. It was dangerous, sure, but it was possible. Men were taught to swim. Men were taught to handle livestock and drive teams and make quick decisions in crisis situations. Men had options. Women generally did not know how to swim. Swimming was considered immodest. Those heavy dresses we talked about, they become death traps in water. They soak up liquid like sponges, becoming heavier and heavier, dragging you down. If you fell into a river in full pioneer dress, you had maybe 60 seconds before you sank, maybe. So the river is not just a physical obstacle. It is a test of whether your society has prepared you to survive. And for women in 1849, the answer is not really. Your survival depends on the mercy of others, on whether the men around you decide you're worth saving. That is not courage. That is vulnerability masked as courage, and it is infuriating. But you know what? Women found ways. They always find ways. Some women learned to swim in secret, practicing in calm water when no one was watching. Some women wore lighter clothes for river crossings, modesty be damned. Some women became experts at reading water, at judging depth and current better than the men. Some women saved lives during crossings because they stayed calm when everyone else panicked. There is a story I love about a woman named Tabitha Brown who crossed multiple rivers on her journey to Oregon in 1846. At one crossing, a child fell out of a wagon into the water. Everyone froze, too shocked to react. Tabitha, who was 66 years old at the time, jumped in fully clothed and grabbed the child. She could not swim. She just waded as deep as she could, grabbed the kid, and hauled them both back to shore through sheer stubborn will. 66 years old, could not swim. Did it anyway because someone needed help and she was the one who acted. That is the thing about crisis situations. They reveal who you really are. Not who you think you are or who you want to be, but who you actually are when everything is falling apart. Right now, standing on the bank of the Platte River in July of 1849, you're about to find out who you are. The water is high, but not impossible. The wagon captain has decided to ford rather than wait for the water to drop or pay for a ferry that may not even exist at this crossing. Your wagon train is going across today. Now, a kind family has agreed to help you. The father will guide your oxen while you ride in the wagon and keep watch for problems. His teenage sons will cross behind you, ready to help if you get stuck. It is generous. It is more than you had any right to expect. You climb into your wagon. You can hear the water now, so loud it drowns out everything else. Your heart is pounding so hard you think it might break through your ribs. Your hands are shaking, but you grip the side of the wagon and you nod to the man holding your oxen. And you whisper a prayer that you're not entirely sure you believe in anymore. The wagon lurches forward. The water rises around the wheels. You can feel the current pushing, testing, looking for weakness. The whole world narrows to this moment, this crossing, this gamble with death. And then you are through. Somehow, impossibly, you are through. The wheels hit solid ground, and the wagon pulls up onto the far bank, and you are alive. You're soaked and shaking, and you might cry or laugh or both, but you are alive. That is 3 major river crossings down. Only about a dozen more to go before you reach Oregon. Aye, but each one you survive makes you a little bit stronger, a little bit more certain that you can do this. The trail is teaching you something important, something you might not have learned any other way. You're capable of more than you ever imagined. The society that raised you said you were weak, helpless, dependent. The society that raised you was wrong. You're still terrified. You're still vulnerable. You're still at the mercy of circumstances you cannot control. But you're also still here, still walking, still fighting, and that counts for something. The next landmark is just ahead. Fort Laramie, the halfway point, the place where you will have to make a decision that might be even harder than crossing a river. A decision about whether to keep going into the unknown or turn back while you still can. But before we get there, before you face that choice, there is one more thing we need to talk about. One more danger that you have been lucky enough to avoid so far, but that is always present, always possible. A danger that comes not from nature or disease or accident, but from other people, from men. From the darkness that exists in some human hearts when there is no law and no consequence and a vulnerable woman traveling alone. Stay with me. This part is going to be hard, but you need to know what you're walking into. Something shifted in camp 3 nights ago. You felt it before you understood it. The way one of the single men looks at you now. The way he lingers near your wagon in the evening. The way he offers help you did not ask for with a smile that does not reach his eyes. His name is William. He is maybe 35, traveling alone, heading to Oregon to claim land. He seems respectable enough. He doesn't drink. He goes to the Sunday services when the wagon train stops on the Sabbath. He helps other families with repairs. But there is something in the way he watches you that makes your skin crawl. Something that tells you he sees your aloneness not as tragedy, but as opportunity. Last night he sat down beside your fire without being invited. He talked about how hard the trail must be for a woman alone, how dangerous, how you really need a man's protection if you are going to survive. And then he said very casually that he has been thinking about taking a wife, that it makes sense, practical sense, for 2 people traveling alone to join forces. He was proposing marriage, right there beside your fire after knowing you for less than a month. And the way he said it, the presumption in his voice, made it clear he did not think you had much choice in the matter. Welcome to one of the darkest, least discussed aspects of the Oregon Trail. The vulnerability of women to violence, harassment, and coercion from the very men who were supposed to protect them. This is the danger that does not make it into the history books. The danger that families did not write about in their letters home because it was shameful, unspeakable, too awful to acknowledge. But it happened, and we need to talk about it. Let me give you some context that will make your blood run cold. The 1850 census of California, which counted people who traveled overland during the gold rush years, showed a ratio of about 14 men for every woman, 14 to 1. On the Oregon Trail, the ratio was better because families were traveling together, but among the single adults, it was still heavily skewed male. What do you think happens when you have a population that is overwhelmingly male, isolated from civilization, living under constant stress and danger, with no real law enforcement? What happens when there is a woman alone with no male relatives to protect her, no legal rights to speak of, and nowhere to run? I wish I could tell you that everyone behaved honorably, that the hardship of the trail brought out the best in people. But that would be a lie. The truth is that some men saw the lawlessness of the trail as an opportunity. An opportunity to do things they could never do back in Missouri or Illinois or Ohio, where there were sheriffs and judges and communities that would hold them accountable. Out here, there was no one to hold anyone accountable. The wagon train had a captain, sure, but he was just another immigrant trying to get to Oregon. He was not a lawman. He had no legal authority. If someone committed a crime, the wagon train could vote to expel them, or they could hold an impromptu trial and mete out frontier justice. But that only happened if the crime was witnessed, if the victim was believed, if enough people cared to do something about it. And how often do you think a woman traveling alone would be believed over a respectable-seeming man? Let me tell you about a statistic that shocked me when I first read it. Nearly 200 people were murdered on the Oregon and California trails during the peak years of migration. 200! Most history books will tell you the trail was relatively safe, that attacks by Native Americans were rare, that the real dangers were disease and accidents. And that is true. But they leave out the part where immigrants were killing each other, family disputes that turned violent, arguments over water rights or camping spots that escalated to gunfire, and yes, attacks on vulnerable women. These things happened. They happened more than we want to admit. There is only one known grave on the entire Oregon Trail where we know for certain the person was murdered, and we know their name. Ephraim Brown. He was killed near South Pass, Wyoming in 1857, apparently by members of his own wagon train in what seems to have been a bitter family dispute. His grave is marked. We know his story. But how many unmarked graves hold women who were killed by men they trusted? How many deaths were written off as accidents or suicides when they were actually murders? We will never know. The evidence is lost. The stories were never told. What we do know comes from fragments. Diary entries that hint at darkness without naming it directly. Letters that mention a woman leaving the wagon train suddenly for unexplained reasons. Court records from Oregon that show women filing for divorce or seeking protection from men they married on the trail under duress. Let me be very clear about what I'm saying here. I am not suggesting that every man on the Oregon Trail was dangerous. Most were not. Most were decent people trying to build a better life for their families. Most treated women with respect and protected the vulnerable. But some did not. And for you, a woman traveling alone, the problem is that you cannot tell the difference until it is too late. William, sitting by your fire with his marriage proposal, might be genuinely kind. He might truly want to help, or he might be a predator who has identified you as prey. How do you know? How can you possibly know? This is the psychological torture of being a vulnerable woman in a lawless space. You have to constantly calculate risk. Is this man safe or dangerous? Is this offer of help genuine, or does it come with strings attached? If you say no to a proposal, will he accept your answer? Or will he make your life miserable? Will he turn the wagon train against you? Will he wait until you are alone and take what you refuse to give? These are not hypothetical fears. These are real calculations that women on the trail had to make every single day. Let me tell you about marriage on the Oregon Trail because understanding the context makes the coercion more clear. Marriage was common, very common. Young girls, some as young as 14 or 15, married along the trail. Sometimes it was love. Sometimes it was necessity. A girl whose father died needed protection. A young man needed a wife to help him qualify for more land under the Donation Land Act. Marriages were practical arrangements. There is a quote from a collection called Women's Diaries of the Westward Journey that has always haunted me. One young woman wrote about marriage customs on the frontier. In those days, the young men were wondering why a girl was not married if she was still single when she was 16. 16, still a child by our standards. But on the frontier, unmarried at 16 was considered unusual, suspicious even. Why would a girl still be single unless there was something wrong with her? This pressure to marry was intense. And for a widow like you, the pressure was different but no less real. You were expected to remarry quickly. For your own protection, people said. For your economic survival. For your reputation. Because here is the awful truth. A woman traveling alone was suspected of being immoral. People wondered why she was alone. If she was widowed, surely she had family who could take her in. If she was running from something, what was it? Was she fleeing a bad situation, or was she the bad situation? Your very presence as an unattached woman made people uncomfortable. You disrupted the social order. You did not fit into the neat family units that made up the wagon train. You were an anomaly. And anomalies were either pitied or mistrusted. So when William proposes marriage, he is not just offering himself. He is offering social acceptance, legitimacy, a place within the community. And he knows you know this. He is counting on you being desperate enough to accept. But here is the question you have to ask yourself. What happens if you say yes? What he barely knows on a trail where you cannot escape, with no courtship, no time to assess compatibility, just a transaction. Some of these marriages worked out. I don't want to pretend they were all disasters. Some couples grew to love each other. Some built good lives together in Oregon. Some were grateful for the partnership and the mutual support. But some did not work out. Some women found themselves trapped in marriages with violent men, abusive men. Men who married them for their labor or their land rights, or simply because they wanted control over another human being. And divorce on the trail or in early Oregon was nearly impossible. You were stuck. You made your choice, and you had to live with it. Even if living with it meant enduring abuse, even if living with it meant becoming someone you did not recognize. There is a story that breaks my heart every time I think about it. A woman who married on the trail quickly out of necessity. Her new husband seemed fine at first, but once they were married, once she was legally his property, he changed. He was cruel. He gambled away their supplies. He hit her when she complained. And there was nothing she could do, nowhere to go, no one to turn to. She stayed with him for 3 years in Oregon. She had 2 children with him, and then, finally, she gathered the courage to leave. She took the children and walked away from the farm they had built together. She had no legal right to anything. The land was in his name. The house was his. Even the children legally were his. But she left anyway, and she survived. She worked as a laundress, as a cook, as whatever she could find. She raised her children alone. And years later, when someone asked her if she regretted leaving, she said, "I only regret that I stayed as long as I did. That is courage. Real courage. Not the dramatic kind that gets celebrated in stories, but the quiet, grinding courage of choosing yourself, even when the entire world tells you that you are wrong." Now, back to William and his proposal. You have to answer him. He is waiting. And the way he is waiting, patient but expectant, tells you that he is very confident you will say yes. Why wouldn't you? You need help. He is offering help. It makes sense, except it doesn't make sense. Not to you, because you didn't walk 1,000 miles through cholera and rivers and grief just to hand your life over to a stranger. You didn't survive this long by making foolish choices and marrying a man you do not love, do not know, and do not trust seems like the most foolish choice of all. So you say no, politely, firmly. You thank him for his offer. You tell him you are managing fine on your own. You try to end the conversation before it becomes confrontational. But he doesn't leave. He sits there, his face darkening, and he says, "You are making a mistake. You will not make it to Oregon without a man. You need me." And there it is, the threat underneath the proposal. The implication that if you refuse him, he will make sure you fail. Maybe he will stop helping you with your wagon. Maybe he will convince other men to stop helping you. Maybe he will spread rumors that damage your reputation within the wagon train. Or maybe he will do something worse. Maybe one night when you are alone, when everyone else is asleep, he will come to your wagon, and there will be no one to hear you scream. This is what I mean when I say the trail was dangerous for women, in ways that had nothing to do with nature. The danger was not always the river or the disease. Sometimes the danger was the man sitting across from you, smiling, acting like he had every right to your future. You cannot sleep well that night. You lie in your wagon with your rifle beside you loaded, ready. Every sound makes you jump. Every shadow could be William. You don't know if your fear is justified or if you are being paranoid. And that uncertainty is almost worse than actual danger. By morning, nothing has happened. William is gone, traveling with a group ahead of yours. You don't see him again. Maybe he accepted your refusal. Maybe he found someone else to bother. Maybe you were lucky. But the fear stays with you. The knowledge that you are vulnerable, that your safety depends on the goodness of others, that at any moment someone could decide you're not worth protecting. This is the reality that women on the Oregon Trail lived with. Constant vigilance, constant assessment of danger, constant negotiation of power dynamics that were stacked against them. And yet they survived. Not all of them, but many of them. They found ways to protect themselves. They formed alliances with other women. They learned which men were safe and which were not. They developed instincts that kept them alive. You're developing those instincts too. You're learning to read people, to trust your gut when something feels wrong, to say no even when it is hard, to protect yourself even when no one else will. These are skills you never wanted to learn, skills you wish you didn't need, but they are keeping you alive, and that matters. The wagon train is approaching Fort Laramie. You can see it in the distance now. A cluster of buildings rising out of the prairie like a mirage. This is the halfway point. 640 miles behind you, roughly the same distance still ahead. This is where you will resupply, where you will rest, where you will make a decision about whether to continue into the mountains or turn back while you still can. But Fort Laramie is not just a supply depot. It is also a crossroads, a place where wagon trains meet and merge and split apart, a place where you might find new traveling companions, a place where the social dynamics of your journey could shift entirely. What you find there might save you, or it might be the beginning of an entirely new kind of danger. Either way, you're about to discover that the halfway point of a journey is not a place of rest. It is a place of reckoning. Come with me. Fort Laramie is waiting, and so is your future. The walls of Fort Laramie rise up against the Wyoming sky like a promise. Adobe and timber, weathered but solid, the first permanent structure you've seen in over 600 miles. Your wagon train pulls into the clearing outside the fort on July 27, 1849. And for the first time in 2 months, you allow yourself to believe that maybe, just maybe, you are going to make it. Fort Laramie sits at the confluence of the Laramie River and the North Platte, positioned perfectly to serve as the great resupply point of the Oregon Trail. It started as a fur trading post back in the 1830s, but by the time you arrive, it has become something else entirely. A lifeline, a marketplace, a moment of civilization in the middle of nowhere, and most importantly, a decision point.
Because here is what you need to understand about Fort Laramie. This is not just a rest stop.
This is the place where you assess whether you have what it takes to continue. You're roughly 1/3 of the way to Oregon. You have traveled about 640 miles. You have roughly 1,400 miles still to go. And those 1,400 miles, they are going to be harder than anything you have faced so far. This is where reality hits. This is where the romantic notion of westward expansion crashes into the brutal math of survival. And this is where you have to decide, keep going or turn back. Let me paint you a picture of what Fort Laramie looks like when you arrive. There are wagons everywhere, dozens of them, maybe 100, all camped in a sprawling circle around the fort. Some are resting before pushing on, some are repairing damage from the first leg of the journey, and some, a depressing number, are preparing to turn around and go home. These are the people they called go-backs. The ones who made it this far and decided they could not make it any farther. You can spot them easily. They are the ones with defeated faces, selling their supplies cheap to anyone who will buy them. Trading oxen for cash because they need money to get back to Missouri. Loading up lighter because they are not planning for 6 more months on the trail, just a long, shameful retreat to the lives they left behind. In a good year, maybe 5% of wagon trains turn back at Fort Laramie. In a bad year, 20%, 1 in 5. And 1849, with its cholera epidemic, is shaping up to be a very bad year. I wonder what it feels like to turn back, to admit defeat, to face everyone you left behind and tell them you failed. That Oregon was too hard, that you were not strong enough. I imagine it takes a different kind of courage than pressing forward. The courage to admit you made a mistake, the courage to survive failure. But you're not thinking about turning back, not yet anyway. Right now, you are focused on the immediate necessities: resupply, repair, rest. The first thing you do is head to the trading post inside the fort. And this is where you get your first hard lesson in frontier economics. Everything here costs double what it cost in independence. Triple sometimes, because they know you are desperate. They know you cannot go forward without supplies, and you cannot go back without admitting defeat. So they charge whatever they want. A new wagon wheel that cost 5 inches Missouri. 5 in Missouri? 15 here. Flour, coffee, sugar, all inflated to prices that make your remaining money feel like pocket change. You stand there in the dim, dusty trading post, surrounded by other immigrants, all negotiating and arguing and trying to stretch their budgets, and you do the math. Can you afford to restock? Can you afford not to? There is a ledger book at Fort Laramie kept by the sutler who runs the trading post. People who could not pay in cash would sometimes trade items instead. The ledger lists what they traded and what they got in return. One entry from 1849 records a woman trading her wedding dress for 20 pounds of flour and 10 pounds of coffee. Her wedding dress, the one nice thing she probably brought from home, gone in exchange for supplies that would last maybe 3 weeks. What do you have left that you could trade if you run out of money? Not much. Your rifle, but you need that. Your spare dress, but you only have 2 and one is already falling apart. Maybe a blanket, maybe a book. You start mentally cataloguing your possessions, assigning them value, preparing for the possibility that you will have to sacrifice something precious to keep moving forward. While you are resupplying, you notice something else about Fort Laramie. It is crowded with native people, Sioux mostly, Lakota and Arapaho, who come to trade and socialize and observe the endless parade of white immigrants passing through their territory. They are not hostile. They are curious. They trade buffalo robes and moccasins for coffee and sugar and metal goods. Some of the women have set up camps outside the fort where they sell food to hungry travelers. This is your first real interaction with indigenous people, and it is nothing like what you expected. The stories you heard back east painted them as savage, dangerous, always on the verge of attack. But these people are just people. Families, children playing, women working, men negotiating trades with the same mix of friendliness and shrewdness as any merchant in Missouri. There is a young Lakota woman, maybe your age, selling fried bread near your wagon. You buy some, partly because you are hungry and partly because you are curious. She speaks a little English, learned from years of traders passing through. You make halting conversation. She asks where you're going. You tell her Oregon. She nods like she has heard this 1,000 times before. Then she says something that stays with you. She says many people come. The buffalo, they go away. The grass, it does not grow back where your wagons go. everything changing. You don't know what to say to that. You didn't think about the impact of all these wagons. Hundreds of thousands of people passing through, their oxen grazing the grass down to nothing, their campfires consuming every scrap of wood, their waste contaminating the water. You were so focused on your own survival that you never considered what you were taking, what you were destroying. This is one of those moments where history gets complicated, where the heroic narrative of westward expansion crashes into the reality of colonization and displacement. You are not the villain of this story. You're just trying to survive. But you are also part of something bigger, something that will ultimately destroy entire nations of people who have lived on this land for thousands of years. I don't think most immigrants in 1849 understood this. Or maybe they understood and didn't care. Manifest Destiny, the idea that Americans were destined to spread across the continent, was a powerful cultural doctrine. It told people like you that you had a right, even a duty, to claim this land. That progress was inevitable and good, no matter who it hurt. But standing there talking to this Lakota woman, seeing the tiredness in her eyes, you get a glimpse of the cost. And it makes you uncomfortable, as it should. Let me tell you about Independence Rock while we're talking about Fort Laramie, because many wagon trains stop there on the way to the fort. Independence Rock is this massive granite boulder rising out of the prairie about 50 miles southwest of Fort Laramie. It is a landmark impossible to miss. And it became tradition for immigrants to carve their names into the rock, a registry of sorts, proof that they were here, that they made it this far. Thousands of names were carved into Independence Rock between 1840 and 1869. Thousands. You can still see some of them today, faint but readable testimony to people who passed through more than 170 years ago. Did you carve your name? Did you want that permanence, that mark of your existence? Or did you look at all those names and feel the weight of all those lives, all those stories, most of them lost to time? Did you wonder how many of the people who carved their names actually made it to Oregon? How many died on the trail and were buried in unmarked graves? These are the thoughts that occupy you during your 3 days at Fort Laramie. You rest, you repair your wagon, you resupply as much as your budget allows. But mostly you think, this is the point of no return. If you keep going from here, you're committed. The mountains are ahead. Winter is coming. There will be no more chances to turn back. You either make it to Oregon or you die trying. The wagon captain calls a meeting on your second night at the fort. He gathers everyone around a large campfire and gives a speech that is part pep talk, part warning, part prayer. He tells you that the hard part is coming, that what you have faced so far was just preparation, that the Rockies and the Blue Mountains and the Snake River Canyon are going to test you in ways you cannot imagine. Then he asks, who wants to continue? Who is still committed to reaching Oregon, no matter what? Everyone raises their hand. Of course, everyone raises their hand. What else are you going to do? You have come too far to quit. You have suffered too much to turn back empty-handed. But there is a desperation in the air, a sense that people are raising their hands not because they are confident, but because they have no choice. That night you cannot sleep. You lie in your wagon listening to the sounds of the fort, traders arguing, horses neighing. Somewhere someone is crying, and you stare up at the canvas roof and you ask yourself the question you've been avoiding for weeks. Can you actually do this? Can you, a woman alone with limited resources and no one to rely on but the charity of strangers, survive another 1,000 miles of trail? Can you cross the mountains? Can you endure another 3 months of walking and working and being afraid? The honest answer is you don't know. Nobody knows. That is the terror and the thrill of this whole enterprise. You're gambling everything on a maybe. Maybe you will make it. Maybe you will not. Maybe Oregon is worth it. Maybe it is not, but here is what you do know. You have survived this far. You have crossed rivers that killed others. You've avoided cholera when it struck down people around you. You have fended off unwanted attention from men who saw you as prey. You have walked 600 miles and you're still here, still standing, still capable. That has to count for something. That has to mean you are stronger than you thought you were. On your last morning at Fort Laramie, you do something you have not done in weeks. You wash your hair, really wash it, in a basin of clean water, scrubbing out 2 months of dust and sweat and fear. It is a small thing, a vain thing maybe, but it feels like reclaiming a piece of yourself, reminding yourself that you're not just a survivor. You're still a human being with dignity and worth. You let your hair dry in the sun while you do your final preparations. You check your wagon one last time. You count your supplies. You say goodbye to the woman who sold you fried bread, even though she probably doesn't care. And then the wagon captain fires his rifle, and the train starts moving, and Fort Laramie disappears behind you, and you are walking again. Always walking. Toward the mountains, toward winter, toward Oregon or death or something in between. The trail climbs from here, not dramatically at first, but steadily. You can feel it in your legs, in the way your oxen strain. You're leaving the plains and entering the mountains. The landscape is changing, and so are you. But before we talk about the mountains, before we get to South Pass and the true test of your endurance, there is something else we need to address. Something darker than anything we have discussed so far. Because the Oregon Trail was not just dangerous, it was not just hard, at violence and displacement and broken promises. The relationship between immigrants and native peoples is about to become central to your story, not because of some dramatic battle or attack, but because of the slow, grinding destruction that your presence represents. Because every step you take toward Oregon is a step that makes life harder for the people who are here first. This is the part of the story that makes us uncomfortable, the part that forces us to reckon with the cost of our history. But we cannot look away, not if we want to understand what really happened out here. So take a breath, gather your strength, because the next part of this journey is going to challenge not just your body but your conscience. August 15th, 1849. You are standing at an elevation of 7,550 feet, and you can barely breathe. South Pass, the Continental Divide, the gateway to the true West. And it is nothing like you imagined. There are no towering peaks here, no dramatic vistas of snow-capped mountains stretching to the sky. South Pass is just a broad, gently sloping corridor between mountain ranges, a 20-mile-wide saddle of land that doesn't even feel like you're crossing mountains at all. But you are. You've just crossed the spine of North America. Water on one side of this pass flows east, eventually to the Atlantic Ocean. Water on the other side flows west to the Pacific. You have crossed an invisible line that divides the entire continent, and even though it doesn't look dramatic, even though it feels almost anticlimactic, this is the moment when you truly become a Westerner. There is no going back from here. Not really, the air is thin up here. That's the first thing you notice. Every breath feels incomplete, like you're only getting half the oxygen you need. Your heart pounds from the simple act of walking. Your head aches. Some people in your wagon train are dizzy, nauseous, struggling to keep moving. This is altitude sickness, though nobody in 1849 calls it that. They just know that the mountains make you feel terrible, and there's nothing to do but push through. The second thing you notice is the cold. It's the middle of August, the height of summer, and you are shivering. The temperature up here can drop below freezing at night, even in July and August. You huddle around your campfire wrapped in every blanket you own. And you think about the people who came through here too late in the season, the ones who got caught in the early snows, the ones who never made it down the other side. Let me tell you about the Donner Party. Because their story haunts this landscape even though they were heading to California, not Oregon. In 1846, 3 years before your journey, a wagon train of 87 people tried to take a shortcut through the mountains. They were delayed by bad decisions and bad luck. And when October came, they were still in the mountains. And then the snow started. They got trapped, completely, utterly trapped, in the high Sierra Nevada, in camps at what is now called Donner Lake. The snow was so deep they could not move, 20 feet deep in some places. They ran out of food. They ate their oxen. They ate leather. They ate bark. And when there was nothing left, some of them ate their dead. Out of 87 people who started the journey, only 48 survived the winter. 34 died at the camps. The rest died along the trail or during the rescue attempts. And the statistics of who lived and who died tell us something crucial about survival in extreme conditions. No one over the age of 49 survived, not one. The oldest survivor was 47. If you were 50 or older, you died. Age was a death sentence. Children between 6 and 14 survived at higher rates than infants under 6. The babies died first. Their small bodies could not withstand the cold and the starvation. And here is the statistic that should matter to you, standing here at South Pass in your late 20s. Women survived at higher rates than men. Significantly higher. 66% of men between 20 and 29 years old died. But women in that age range had much better odds. Well, biology. Women carry more body fat than men on average. That fat is insulation. It is also stored energy. When you're starving, your body burns fat before it burns muscle. Women's bodies are designed to withstand famine better than men's bodies because evolution prepared women to survive periods of scarcity in order to protect pregnancies and nursing infants. Women also need fewer calories to maintain their body weight. A woman can survive on less food than a man of the same size. In a situation where every scrap of nutrition matters, where you are rationing food down to ounces per day, that difference becomes the difference between life and death. So your gender, which has been a liability for this entire journey, suddenly becomes an advantage. Not a guarantee, mind you. Women died too. But if it came down to starvation in the mountains, your body would fight harder to keep you alive than a man's body would fight for him. This is cold comfort, I know. You're not planning to get trapped in the mountains. You're planning to get through them before winter. But it's good to know. Good to understand that you are tougher than you look, that your body, which society has always told you is weak and fragile and in need of male protection, is actually remarkably resilient. The crossing of South Pass takes 3 days. 3 days of steady climbing, though the slope is so gradual you barely notice it until you look back and see how far below the plains have fallen. 3 days of thin air and cold nights and a landscape that looks barren compared to the green prairies you left behind. Up here, the vegetation changes. There are fewer trees. The grass is sparser. Everything is tougher, harder, adapted to survive in conditions that would kill softer plants. You feel a kinship with those plants. You're tougher now too, harder, adapted to survive in conditions that would have killed the person you were back in Independence. On the western slope of South Pass, you encounter something that makes you stop and stare. Snow in August, patches of it in the shadowed valleys, stubborn remnants of last winter that have not yet melted. You touch it, half convinced it cannot be real. Snow in summer, it seems impossible, but this is the reality of mountain weather. The rules you knew back east do not apply here. There is a shortcut some wagon trains take called the Subblt Greenwood Cutoff. It saves about 7 days of travel, which sounds amazing, but those 7 days come at a cost. The cutoff crosses 45 miles of desert with no water, no grass, and no fuel for fires. 45 miles where your oxen will suffer, where you will suffer, where people have died from dehydration and exposure. Your wagon captain decides not to take the cutoff. He says the risk is too great, especially this late in the season with the heat still fierce. Some people in your train argue 7 days could make the difference between reaching Oregon before the snows or getting trapped like the Donner Party. But the captain holds firm. Better to take the longer, safer route than gamble on a shortcut that might kill you. You're grateful for this decision. You have taken enough risks. You don't need to add death by dehydration to the list of things that might kill you. As you descend the western slope, as South Pass falls behind you, you start to see the Rocky Mountains properly. Not the gentle pass, but the real mountains. Jagged peaks in the distance, still snow-covered even in summer. The Wind River range to the north, beautiful and terrifying in equal measure. This is when it hits you, the sheer scale of what you are attempting. You are a speck, a tiny human being crossing a landscape so vast and indifferent that it doesn't even notice your existence. These mountains were here millions of years before you. They will be here millions of years after you are gone. They do not care if you live or die, and yet you keep walking. What else can you do? You have come too far to stop. The mountains don't care, but you care. You care about surviving. You care about reaching Oregon. You care about proving to yourself that you can do this impossible thing. There is a weird beauty in the mountains once you adjust to the harshness. The way the light hits the peaks at sunset, turning them gold and pink and purple. The clarity of the stars at night, so many of them, more than you have ever seen, blazing against the black sky like diamonds. The silence, the profound, almost religious silence that comes from being far from civilization, far from anything human-made. One night you stand outside your wagon and just look up at the stars, and you feel something you've not felt in months. Not peace exactly, but a kind of acceptance. An understanding that you are part of something bigger than yourself. That this journey, as brutal as it has been, has changed you in ways you're only beginning to understand. You're not the same person who left Independence. That person was softer, more naive, more dependent on others. That person believed what society told her about what women could and could not do. That person needed permission to be strong. You don't need permission anymore. The trail has beaten it out of you. The trail has taught you that strength is not something you ask for. It is something you discover when you have no other choice. But here is the thing about the mountains that nobody tells you until you experience it yourself. They are not the hardest part. South Pass is challenging, yes. The altitude is rough. But the trail here is well established. Thousands of wagons have passed through before you. The route is clear. The real challenge, the true nightmare, is still ahead. The Blue Mountains of Oregon. Those are the mountains that break people. Those are the mountains where you will have to pull your wagon up slopes so steep that your oxen cannot do it alone. Where you will have to use ropes and pulleys and every ounce of strength you possess. Where going downhill is more dangerous than going up because if your wagon gets away from you, if it starts to roll, it will crush you. But we are not there yet. Right now, you are still in the relatively gentle terrain west of South Pass. You're following the Sweetwater River, which lives up to its name. The water here is clean and cold and sweet-tasting, nothing like the alkaline water you've been drinking for weeks. You fill every container you have. You drink until your stomach aches. You wash your face and hands and feel for just a moment clean. The trail follows the Sweetwater for about 100 miles. It is pleasant as trails go. The weather is good, your oxen are holding up, your supplies are adequate, you're making decent time. For a few weeks, the journey almost feels manageable. But then you reach a place called 3 Crossings, where the trail crosses the Sweetwater River 3 times in quick succession. And this is where you are reminded that nothing on the Oregon Trail is ever easy for long. The crossings are not deep, but the current is strong. And by the 3rd crossing, everyone is exhausted and careless. That is when accidents happen. When someone's ox loses its footing, when a wagon wheel catches on a rock and the whole thing tips sideways, when a child who has been carefully watched for 2 months suddenly slips and falls into the water. You don't see the accident, but you hear it. The scream, the splash, the shouting. By the time you reach the scene, they have already pulled the boy out. He's alive, sputtering and crying, and his mother is holding him so tight he can barely breathe. But he is alive. This time everyone got lucky. Not every crossing ends that way. You know this. Today, for this crossing, everyone survives, and you allow yourself a moment of gratitude. The trail is teaching you to appreciate small victories. A successful river crossing, a night without rain, a meal that tastes good, an hour without pain or fear or exhaustion. These things would have seemed trivial back in Missouri. Out here, they are everything. You are learning what really matters. And it is not the things you thought mattered. It is not comfort or security or social status. It is survival. It is making it through another day. It is the feeling of your own heartbeat, steady and strong, reminding you that you are still here, still fighting, still alive. The Rockies are behind you now. South Pass is behind you. You have crossed the Continental Divide. You're officially in Oregon territory, though you're still hundreds of miles from the Willamette Valley where you plan to settle. But here is what you need to know, what I need to prepare you for. The journey is about to get complicated in a different way. The physical challenges will continue, yes. The mountains are not done with you. But you're also about to enter territory where your relationship with the people who have always lived here becomes central to your story. Because the truth is, you are not exploring wilderness. You are passing through homelands, nations, territories that belong to people who have complex societies and cultures and histories that stretch back thousands of years. And those people are watching you, watching the endless stream of wagons, watching their world change in ways they cannot stop. Some of them will help you, some of them will trade with you, and some of them will be angry, and that anger will be justified, and you're going to have to navigate that reality while still trying to survive. This is where the Oregon Trail becomes more than just a survival story. This is where it becomes a story about 2 worlds colliding. And nobody escapes that collision unchanged. Take a breath. Rest while you can. Because the next part of this journey is going to ask you to be more than just strong. It is going to ask you to be wise. They approach your wagon train just after dawn, when the morning mist is still rising from the river. About 20 riders, moving slowly, deliberately, not threatening, but not exactly friendly either. Your heart stops. This is it. This is the moment you have been dreading since you left Missouri. The moment everyone warned you about. The savage attack, the massacre, the stories that kept you awake at night. Except it is not an attack. They are coming to trade. The Shoshone riders pull up about 50 yards from your circled wagons. One of them raises his hand in a gesture that clearly means peace. Your wagon captain, to his credit, returns the gesture. For a long, tense moment, nobody moves. And then slowly, carefully, both sides approach each other. What happens next would be almost funny if your hands were not shaking so badly. The Shoshone have fresh fish. Lots of it. They caught it this morning in the Snake River. They want to trade it for coffee, sugar, maybe some cloth if you have it. That's it. That's the whole terrifying encounter. A fish market, not a massacre. A transaction. You trade a pound of coffee for 6 beautiful trout. The Shoshone man who hands them to you smiles. He has kind eyes. He looks tired. He says something in his language that you don't understand, but the tone is clear enough. Safe travels. Good luck. Something like that. And then they ride away. And you are left standing there with 6 fish and the realization that everything you have been told about Native people might be a lie. Here is the truth about Native American attacks on the Oregon Trail. They were rare. Astonishingly rare. Historians estimate that out of the roughly 350,000 immigrants who traveled the Oregon and California trails between 1840 and 1869, fewer than 400 were killed by Native Americans. Fewer than 400. That is about 1/10%. You had a better chance of dying from cholera, from drowning, from accidents, from your own fellow immigrants than from Native attack. But the fear was real. Wagon trains circled their wagons every night, not primarily to defend against attack, but the symbolism was there. The message was clear. We are under siege. We're surrounded by danger. We must be vigilant. And some of that fear was justified. Attacks did happen. People did die. But context matters, and the context is this. By 1849, native nations had been watching white immigrants pour through their territory for almost a decade. Hundreds of thousands of people consuming resources, killing buffalo, bringing diseases, changing everything. Let me tell you about a girl named Susan Bordeaux. She was the daughter of a French-American fur trader and a Brûlé Lakota mother. She grew up near Fort Laramie in the 1840s and 1850s, and even though she was just a child, she understood what was happening. She later wrote about watching the wagon trains pass through, about the devastation they left behind. The buffalo herds, which had been vast and seemingly endless, started to thin. The immigrants hunted them for sport, for food, for hides. But more than that, the wagon trains disrupted the migration patterns. Thousands of oxen grazing the grass down to nothing. Thousands of campfires consuming the timber. The landscape itself was changing. Susan wrote, "The devastating effect that the immigrant wagon trains had on the land was seared into my mind." Seared. That is the word she used. This was trauma. This was watching your world be destroyed and being powerless to stop it. Now imagine you are a Shoshone or Paiute or Bannock person watching this destruction. Watching your primary food source disappear. Watching the plants you depend on for medicine get trampled. Watching the water sources get contaminated. What would you do? How would you respond? Some tribes responded with hospitality. They traded with immigrants. They helped lost wagon trains find water. They guided people through difficult terrain. There are countless diary entries from immigrants expressing gratitude for native assistance. A Paiute man who showed them a spring, a Shoshone woman who helped deliver a baby, a Nez Perce guide who led them through a mountain pass. But some tribes responded with anger, and honestly, who can blame them? Their generosity and help were being repaid with destruction and displacement. The Fort Laramie Treaty of 1851, which was supposed to guarantee native land rights in exchange for allowing safe passage for immigrants, was violated almost immediately by the US government. Promises were made and broken over and over again. Let me tell you about an incident that happened in 1854, just 5 years after your journey, but it illustrates the tensions that were already building in 1849. It is called the Grattan Massacre, though that name is deeply misleading about who the real victims were. A cow wandered away from a wagon train and into a Lakota encampment. The Lakota, who were hungry because the buffalo were disappearing, killed and ate the cow. The owner reported the theft to the army at Fort Laramie. A young lieutenant named Grattan, arrogant and inexperienced, took 29 soldiers to punish the Lakota. The Lakota chief offered a horse in payment for the cow, a more than fair exchange. But Grattan refused. He wanted to arrest someone. He wanted to make an example, so he opened fire on the Lakota camp. He killed the chief, and then the Lakota, defending themselves, killed Grattan and all 29 of his soldiers. This incident, which started over a single cow, escalated into the Plains Indian Wars of the 1860s. Wars that killed thousands. Wars that ultimately ended with the destruction of the native way of life. Over a cow. Because a young soldier refused to accept a fair payment. Because he saw native people as less than human, as obstacles to be removed, rather than human beings with rights and dignity. This is the context of your journey. You're not exploring empty wilderness. You're passing through a war zone, a slow-motion catastrophe. And even though you personally have not hurt anyone, even though you're just trying to survive, you are part of the machine that is destroying nations. Does that make you a bad person? I don't think so. You did not create manifest destiny. You did not write the laws that stole native land. You're just a woman trying to get to Oregon, but you are complicit by your presence, by your participation. You're part of something bigger and darker than your individual story. And I think, on some level, you know this. You see it in the eyes of the people you trade with. You hear it in the warnings from scouts who tell you which tribes are friendly and which are not. As if native people are weather patterns instead of human beings making rational decisions about how to respond to invasion. There is a diary entry from a woman named Amelia Stewart Knight, traveling in 1853, that captures this moral confusion perfectly. She wrote about encountering a group of native people who helped her wagon train cross a difficult river. She was grateful. She gave them food. And then, almost in the same breath, she wrote about how she feared them, how she kept her rifle loaded, how she did not trust them. Grateful and afraid, helped and threatened. These contradictions lived side by side in the minds of immigrants because the propaganda back east had been so effective. The stories about savage Indians were everywhere, in newspapers, in books, in the speeches of politicians who wanted to justify westward expansion. But the reality, when you actually met native people, was almost always more complicated. They were not savage, they were not mindless killers, they were people. People with families and cultures and legitimate grievances against the flood of white settlers destroying their world. Here is something that will probably surprise you. Native Americans helped more immigrants than they killed, by a lot. There are documented cases of Native people rescuing lost wagon trains, sharing food with starving immigrants, guiding people through terrain they did not understand, acting with generosity and kindness towards strangers who were objectively destroying their way of life. Why would they do this? Why would they help people who were hurting them? Some did it for trade goods. Coffee and sugar and metal tools were valuable. But I think many did it because hospitality was a core value of their cultures. Because they believed in helping people in need, even when those people were part of the problem. That generosity was rarely returned. The immigrants took the help. They survived because of it. And then they went to Oregon and supported policies that forced Native people off their land and onto reservations. They told stories that erased the help they received and emphasized only the danger. There is a writer named David Lewis, who was a member of the Confederated Tribes of Grand Ronde, who put it this way in a modern interview about the Oregon Trail. Tribal people were used to hosting and helping guests, but they encountered people who refused to share food or resources because they were not like them, refused to share with the very people whose land they were crossing, whose resources they were consuming. That is the moral failure at the heart of this story. Not individual cruelty necessarily, but a systemic refusal to see Native people as fully human, as deserving of the same rights and considerations that white immigrants expected for themselves. Now, let me be very clear about something. I am not saying that you personally refused to share. I am not saying you were cruel or unkind. You might have been one of the good ones, one of the immigrants who treated Native people with respect and fairness. But here is the thing about systemic injustice. Your individual goodness does not change the system. You could be the kindest, most generous person on the trail, and you would still be part of the machine of colonization. You would still benefit from policies that hurt Native people. You would still claim land that was taken from them. This is uncomfortable to sit with. I know it is. It was uncomfortable for me when I first really understood it. Because we want to believe that if we are good people, if we have good intentions, then we are not part of the problem. But history doesn't work that way. We can be good people and still participate in bad systems. The question is, what do we do with that knowledge? How do we reckon with it? For you, in 1849, the answer is probably nothing. You survive, you get to Oregon, you build your life. You try not to think too hard about the cost, because thinking about it doesn't change anything and it might break you. But for us, looking back from 2025, we have the obligation to tell the truth, to not romanticize the Oregon Trail as this heroic adventure, to acknowledge that it was also an invasion, a displacement, a tragedy for the people who were here first. Both things can be true at once. The immigrants suffered. They showed courage and resilience. They built communities and lives. And the Native people suffered more. They lost their land, their way of life, in some cases their lives. Entire nations were destroyed. Your wagon train continues west through Idaho, following the Snake River. The landscape here is harsh. Volcanic rock and sagebrush and dust. The river runs through a deep canyon, sometimes hundreds of feet below the trail. You can hear it, but you cannot always reach it. When you do find a way down to the water, you guard it jealously, because water is life, and the next source might be a day away. The encounters with Native people continue. Sometimes it is trade, sometimes it is just passing by each other, both parties wary but not hostile. Once, a group of Bannock riders follows your wagon train for half a day, not threatening, just watching, making sure you keep moving, making sure you do not settle here. It is a strange kind of parallel existence. You are in their world, but not of it, moving through like ghosts, leaving destruction in your wake, but not staying long enough to see the full consequences. And then one evening, something happens that changes your perspective entirely. A young Native girl, maybe 10 years old, comes into your camp. She's alone, which is unusual. She's asking for food. She looks thin, desperate. You give her some of your bread and dried meat. She eats it so fast she almost chokes. And then she just sits there, staring at you with eyes that have seen too much for someone so young. And you realize this child is starving. Her people are starving. Because the buffalo are gone, because the wagon trains have consumed everything, you are part of the reason she is hungry. Not intentionally, not maliciously, but you are part of it. She leaves after a few minutes. You never learn her name. You never see her again. But you think about her for the rest of your life, wondering if she survived, wondering what became of her, wondering if she hated you or pitied you or even thought about you at all. This is the weight you carry now, whether you wanted to or not. The knowledge that your survival came at someone else's cost. That's not unique to the Oregon Trail, by the way. That's human history. We survive by taking from others resources, land, opportunity. The question is whether we acknowledge it, whether we feel the weight of it, whether we let it change us. You are changed. You have to be. You cannot see what you have seen and remain the same. The trail is narrowing now. The mountains are rising again. The Blue Mountains are ahead, and they are going to be brutal. But before you face them, before you tackle the hardest physical challenge of the entire journey, you need to deal with one more obstacle, one more test of endurance. The Snake River Canyon. Miles of walking alongside a river you can hear but cannot reach. Miles of volcanic rock that tears at your shoes and your wagon wheels. Miles of heat and dust and the constant psychological torture of knowing water is right there but you cannot get to it. This is where people break, not from one big disaster, but from the accumulation of small torments. The relentless, grinding difficulty of a trail that never lets up, never gives you a break, never says good enough. You have suffered enough, but you are not going to break. You have come too far. You are too stubborn, too angry, too determined to prove everyone wrong. The Snake River Canyon is waiting, and after that, the Blue Mountains, and after that, finally, Oregon. We are almost there. Stay with me. The end is in sight. September the 12th, 1849. You've been walking for 5 months, 143 days, and you've just encountered the closest thing to hell you've ever seen. The Snake River Canyon stretches before you like a scar across the earth. The river itself runs hundreds of feet below, cutting through black volcanic rock that looks like it was vomited up from the center of the planet and left to cool in twisted, jagged formations. The trail clings to the canyon rim, narrow and treacherous, with nothing between you and the drop except air and prayer. You can hear the river. That's the cruelest part. You can hear it rushing through the canyon below, cold and clear and completely unreachable. Your water barrels are nearly empty. Your throat is so dry it hurts to swallow. And there is water right there, so close you could hit it with a stone if you threw hard enough, but you cannot get to it. Welcome to what many immigrants call the most difficult stretch of the entire Oregon Trail. Not the most dangerous, maybe, but the most soul-crushing, the most psychologically brutal. Because it is not one big challenge you can prepare for and overcome. It is just mile after mile after mile of relentless hardship with no relief. The volcanic rock is sharp. It cuts through boot soles like they are made of paper. Your shoes, which were already worn thin from 5 months of walking, are disintegrating. Some people in your wagon train are walking barefoot now, their feet wrapped in cloth that turns red with blood by the end of each day. The wagon wheels crack and splinter. The iron rims come loose. Every 100 yards, someone has to stop to make repairs. Oh, the heat. September should be cooling down. But here in the canyon, the black rock absorbs the sun and radiates it back like an oven. The temperature climbs to 100 degrees during the day. There is no shade, no trees, no relief. Just rock and sun and the mocking sound of water you cannot reach. One of the families in your wagon train loses an ox. The animal just collapses, dead from heat exhaustion and dehydration. They have to butcher it right there on the trail in the blazing sun, with flies swarming immediately. The meat will spoil within hours in this heat. They take what they can carry and leave the rest. By nightfall, you can smell the rotting carcass from a mile away. And you know that somewhere behind you, another wagon train will pass that same spot and smell that same smell, and know that death is everywhere on this trail. Always has been, always will be. There is a moment deep in the canyon when you seriously consider giving up. Not turning back, just giving up. Sitting down on the black rock and waiting to die, because continuing forward seems impossible. And you are so tired, so unbelievably tired. Not just physically tired, so tired. Tired of fighting, tired of suffering, tired of being afraid. You sit down right there on the trail. Your wagon stops behind you because the oxen will not move without guidance. The family traveling near you asks if you are all right. You don't answer. You just sit, and then something happens. Something small but significant. A woman from that family, maybe 40 years old, sits down beside you. She doesn't say anything. She just sits. After a minute, she pulls out a canteen and hands it to you. There is maybe 2 swallows of water left in it. She gives it to you anyway. You drink. The water is warm and tastes like metal, but it's the best thing you have ever tasted. You hand the canteen back. She shakes her head. She wants you to have it all. This is the moment when you understand something fundamental about survival. It is not about being the strongest or the smartest or the most prepared. It is about being willing to accept help, to let other people carry you when you cannot carry yourself, to believe that you are worth saving even when you don't feel like you are. You stand up, you take the reins of your oxen, you start walking again. The woman walks beside you for a while, not talking, just being present, and somehow that makes it bearable. After 3 days in the Snake River Canyon, the trail finally descends to the river. There is a crossing here, and it is treacherous, but at least there is water. You drink until you are sick. You fill every container.
You wash your face and hands and feel human again for the first time in days.
But the relief is temporary, because looming ahead, visible now in the distance, are the Blue Mountains. And if the Snake River Canyon was hell, the Blue Mountains are where you earn your passage out of it. Let me tell you something that is going to sound impossible but is absolutely true. The Blue Mountains were harder to cross than the Rockies, harder than South Pass, harder than anything you have faced so far. Not because they are higher, they are not. The highest peak is only about 6,000 feet, but because the terrain is so steep and the trail so poorly maintained that getting wagons through requires a level of physical exertion that pushes humans to their absolute limits. Here is how it works. You approach a slope that is too steep for the oxen to pull the wagon up, too steep for the wagon to climb under its own power. So you have to help, you and every able-bodied person in your wagon train. The men unyoke the oxen and lead them to the top of the slope. Then they bring down ropes, long, thick ropes that they attach to the wagons. And then everyone pulls. Men, women, older children. Everyone grabs a rope and pulls with everything they have. The wagon inches up the slope. Your hands burn where the rope cuts into your skin. Your shoulders scream. Your legs shake from the effort. You're pulling hundreds of pounds of wagon up a mountainside. And if anyone lets go, if the rope slips, the whole thing could roll backward and crush whoever is behind it. But you don't let go. Nobody lets go. Because this is survival. Because you have come too far to fail now. Because giving up is not an option when you are this close to Oregon. And when you finally get the wagon to the top, when you collapse on the ground, gasping for breath with your heart pounding and your hands bleeding, you don't even get to rest because there is another wagon behind you and another, and everyone has to help everyone else. That is the rule. That is how this works. Going downhill is somehow worse. At least going up you have some control. Going down, gravity is trying to kill you. The wagons want to roll. They want to pick up speed and careen down the slope and smash into trees or rocks or go flying off the trail entirely. So you have to slow them down. You take long poles and wedge them through the wheels, creating drag. You tie ropes to the back of the wagon and have people hold on, acting as brakes. You pile rocks behind the wheels every few feet so the wagon doesn't slide backward. It is painstaking, exhausting, terrifying. One mistake and you lose everything. There is a memory from a woman named Marion Boatman who crossed the Blue Mountains in 1852. She described watching the men and women work together to lower a wagon down a particularly steep slope. She wrote, "The women would lay rocks down behind the wagon so it would not roll backwards. The men pulled on ropes to keep it from going too fast. It took 2 hours to go 100 yards. 2 hours for 100 yards. The Blue Mountains are about 40 miles across. Do that math. That is the kind of grinding, relentless labor that breaks people. Not in one dramatic moment, but through sheer accumulated exhaustion. And you, as a woman alone, do not have a husband to help pull ropes. You do not have sons strong enough to hold the wagon. You're entirely dependent on the goodwill of others. Again. But here is the thing, you have proven yourself by now. 5 months on the trail have shown everyone that you are capable, that you work hard, that you don't complain more than anyone else, that you pull your weight literally when ropes need pulling. So when it is your turn, when your wagon needs to go up or down a slope that seems impossible, people help. They don't help because they pity you. They help because you are part of the wagon train. Because out here, everyone depends on everyone else. Because the social rules from back east don't apply when you're fighting mountains together. The Blue Mountains are also where you see the most wagon abandonment. People whose wagons are too damaged, too heavy, or too much trouble just leave them. They pack what they can carry onto their backs or onto horses if they have them, and they walk the rest of the way to Oregon. You see these abandoned wagons everywhere. Some still have belongings in them, furniture, tools, things people thought they would need in Oregon but could not justify carrying over the mountains. You are tempted to abandon your wagon too. It would be easier, faster. But the wagon has everything you own. Your supplies, your tools, your hope of building a life in Oregon. If you abandon it, you arrive with nothing. Absolutely nothing. And starting from nothing in a new territory where you have no connections and no safety net. That is a death sentence. So you keep the wagon. You get it over every impossible slope and down every terrifying descent. Because giving up the wagon means giving up on the future you have been suffering for. There is a particular descent that becomes infamous among your wagon train. It is so steep that you can barely see the bottom. So narrow that the wagon wheels are inches from the edge on both sides. So rocky that keeping the wagon upright seems like a miracle. You watch 3 wagons go down before yours. 2 make it. 1 does not. It tips sideways halfway down, spills all its contents, and has to be abandoned. The family salvages what they can and continues on foot. You watch the mother's face as she leaves behind a rocking chair that must have meant something to her. Watch her touch it one last time and then walk away without looking back. That image haunts you. The rocking chair sitting there on the mountainside waiting for no one. A monument to what people sacrifice to get to Oregon. When it is your turn, you're shaking with fear. But the same families who have been helping you all along are there. They have their ropes ready. They have their poles and rocks ready. They have done this before. They know what they are doing. You guide your oxen to the edge. Someone ties ropes to the back of your wagon. Someone else wedges poles through the wheels. And then slowly, carefully, with a dozen people working in coordination, your wagon starts down. It takes forever. Every foot feels like a mile. The wagon tilts. Someone shouts a warning. They adjust. They add another rock. They pull harder on the ropes. The oxen bellow and dig in their hooves. And inch by inch you descend. When you reach the bottom, you actually cry. Not sad tears, relief tears, joy tears. You made it. Your wagon made it. Everything you own is still intact. You survived the Blue Mountains. The mountains have taken everything from you. Your strength, your pride, your illusions about what you are capable of. But they have also given you something. Proof. Undeniable, irrefutable proof that you can do hard things, that you can push beyond what seems possible, that you are tougher than you ever imagined. On the western side of the Blue Mountains, the landscape changes suddenly, dramatically. There are trees again, real forests, pine and fir and cedar, tall and green and smelling like life. There is grass. There are streams with cold, clean water. After months of desert and volcanic rock and endless brown landscape, the color green is almost shocking. This is Oregon, real Oregon, the Oregon you were promised, the Oregon you have been suffering for. It is beautiful. It is genuinely, objectively beautiful. And you allow yourself, for the first time since leaving Missouri, to believe that maybe this was worth it. Maybe the suffering had a purpose. Maybe you were going to be all right. The trail follows the Columbia River now. The river is massive here, wide and powerful, flowing west toward the Pacific Ocean. You are so close, maybe 2 weeks from the Willamette Valley. 2 weeks from the end of this nightmare. But those 2 weeks are going to test you in a different way. Not physically. You have proven you can handle physical challenges. But emotionally, psychologically, because now that the end is in sight, now that survival seems likely instead of impossible, you have to confront what comes next. What are you going to do in Oregon? How are you going to build a life as a woman alone, with no money and no land rights and no safety net? You survived the trail, but can you survive Oregon? These questions keep you awake at night. These questions are scarier than mountains or rivers or disease, because at least on the trail the goal was clear. Walk, survive, keep moving. In Oregon the goal is murkier. Build a life. But how? What fool? The Willamette Valley is waiting. And with it the next chapter of your story, the one where you discover whether surviving was enough. Whether the woman you became on the trail is strong enough to build something from nothing. Let's finish this together. One more section and we'll know if you made it. If this impossible journey had a happy ending, or at least an ending you could live with. Stay close. We are almost home. You stand at the edge of the Willamette Valley in late September 1849, looking down at the green expanse below, and you realize something profound. The question is not whether you will survive. You already did. You are here. You walked 2,100 miles. You crossed a continent. You became a statistic that defied the odds. But survival is not a binary. It is not just alive or dead. It is a spectrum. And where you land on that spectrum depends on factors you are only now beginning to understand. Let me take you back through your journey and show you what determined who lived and who died on the Oregon Trail. Because the data, when you look at it closely, tells a story that is both brutal and beautiful. A story about human resilience and the razor-thin margins between triumph and tragedy. Out of the estimated 350,000 people who attempted the Oregon Trail between 1840 and 1869, roughly 30,000 died along the way. That is about 1 in 10. Or, to put it another way, 9 out of 10 people survived. Those are actually pretty good odds when you consider what they were facing. But those odds were not distributed evenly. Some people had much better chances than others. Factor number 1, age. This is the big one. The single most important predictor of survival was how old you were when you started the journey. If you were under 30, your chances were excellent. Young bodies recover faster from illness. Young bodies can handle the physical punishment of walking 15 miles a day for months. Young bodies survive starvation better, fight off disease more effectively, heal from injuries that would kill older people. You're 26. That puts you in the sweet spot. Old enough to have some wisdom and judgment. Young enough that your body can take the abuse. If you were 60, your chances of making it to Oregon would be less than 50-50. If you were over 70, almost zero. The trail did not forgive age. But here is the twist. Being too young was also dangerous. Infants and small children died at horrifying rates. They were vulnerable to disease. They couldn't walk on their own. They required constant care that exhausted their parents. And in crisis situations when resources were scarce, children sometimes suffered the most. So your age is in your favor. Checkmark number 1 for survival. Factor number 2, community connections. This is where being a woman alone should have killed you. And yet, somehow, it did not. How? Let me tell you about the families who helped you. The ones who let you join their wagon train even though you were a liability. The ones who helped you cross rivers. The ones who pulled your wagon up mountains, the ones who shared food when you ran out, the ones who sat beside you when you wanted to give up. You survived because of them. That is the truth. You did not make it to Oregon through sheer individual grit and determination. You made it because other people decided you were worth saving. Because wagon trains at their best functioned as communities. Because the social bonds that formed on the trail were sometimes strong enough to overcome the prejudices and limitations of the era. Not every woman alone was this lucky. Some were shunned, some were exploited, some were abandoned when they became inconvenient. But you happened to fall in with decent people, people who saw you as a human being deserving of help rather than as a burden to be shed. This is luck, pure luck. You cannot control which wagon train you join. You cannot control whether the people in it are kind or cruel. This is one of those factors that determined survival but was completely beyond individual control. Factor number 3. Resources. Money, supplies, the quality of your wagon and your oxen. We talked about this early in the journey, but it matters all the way through. You started with barely enough. You ran out of money halfway through. You traded away precious possessions to keep going. By the time you reached Oregon, you had nothing left. But you had enough to get there, barely. Some people did not. Some people started with inadequate supplies because they could not afford better. Some people had their wagons break beyond repair. Some people lost their oxen and could not afford replacements. These people often died, or they turned back, or they arrived in Oregon so destitute that they could not survive the first winter. You made it because you started with just enough, and you managed it carefully enough. That is skill, yes, but it is also luck. Luck that your wagon held together. Luck that your oxen survived. Luck that you did not encounter more disasters than your resources could handle. Factor number 4, timing. When you left, when you arrived, when you encountered challenges along the way. You left in late April. Perfect timing. Early enough that there was grass for the oxen. Late enough that the rivers were not in full spring flood. You reached South Pass in August. Good timing. You made it through the Blue Mountains in September. Excellent timing. You arrived in Oregon in early October, before the worst of the winter rains. If you had left a month later, you might have been caught in early mountain snows. If you had left a month earlier, you might have starved your oxen before they could graze. Timing mattered, and you got it right, either through careful planning or dumb luck. Factor number 5, health. This is the factor nobody could control. You either got cholera or you did not. You either had the constitution to withstand months of hard labor and poor nutrition, or you did not. You were healthy. You stayed healthy. That is not something you did. That is something that happened to you. Yes, you boiled your water when you could. Yes, you tried to avoid contaminated sources, but cholera was a lottery. People who did everything right still died. People who were reckless sometimes survived. You won that lottery over and over again. Every time your wagon train encountered disease, every time cholera swept through the camps, you did not get it. Was that because you were careful or because you were lucky? Probably both, but the luck mattered more. Factor number 6, gender. And this is where things get interesting, because being a woman was both a liability and an advantage. Liability, you were physically weaker than men on average. You were less likely to know survival skills like hunting or navigation. You were more vulnerable to violence and exploitation. You had fewer legal rights and economic options. Society had not prepared you for this kind of challenge. But advantage. Women survived certain challenges better than men. Starvation, for instance. Women's bodies are more efficient. They store fat better. They require fewer calories. In extreme situations like the Donner Party, women survived at higher rates because their biology was optimized for scarcity. Women also seem to handle the psychological stress differently. Not better necessarily, but differently. Men were more likely to take risks that got them killed, more likely to die from accidents with firearms, more likely to drown trying to save livestock. Women were more likely to be cautious, to ask for help, to admit when they could not do something alone. Both approaches had costs and benefits. But the data suggests that being a woman, despite all the disadvantages, did not significantly reduce your chances of survival. In some situations, it might have actually helped. Factor number 7, skills and adaptability. This is the one factor you could actually control. How quickly you learned, how well you adapted, how willing you were to do things you'd never done before. You learned to drive oxen. You learned to start fires with buffalo chips. You learned to read rivers and judge weather. You learned to pace yourself, to conserve energy, to push through pain without breaking. You learned which people to trust and which to avoid. You learned to accept help without losing your dignity. These were not skills you brought from Missouri. These were skills you developed on the trail, and they saved your life. Multiple times. This is the factor that gives me hope when I look at the Oregon Trail, because it means survival was not purely about luck or privilege. Yes, those things mattered, but adaptability mattered too. The ability to learn, to grow, to become someone stronger and more capable than you were when you started. You did that. You became a different person, a tougher person, a survivor. So let me add it all up. Let me calculate your odds. Age favorable. 26. You found people who helped you. Resources minimal but adequate. You had just enough. Timing favorable. You started and finished at the right times. Health favorable. You avoided cholera and major illness. Gender neutral. Disadvantages balanced by advantages. Adaptability high. You learned fast and adapted well. Your odds of survival? I would put them at about 75%, maybe 80%. Better than average because of your age and timing. Worse than average because you were alone with limited resources. But overall, you had a real chance. And you made it. You beat the odds. Not by a lot, not comfortably. But you are standing here in Oregon, alive. And that is more than 30,000 other people can say. But survival is not the end of the story. It is just the beginning, because now you have to survive Oregon. You have to build a life from nothing. You have to face the reality that the promised land is not quite what you were promised, that the struggle does not end just because the walking does. Some women thrived in Oregon. Women like Tabitha Brown, who arrived with 6 cents and built a university. Women like Bethenia Owenzadere, who became one of the first female doctors in the Pacific Northwest. Women who took the strength they developed on the trail and used it to build extraordinary lives. Some women merely survived. They worked hard jobs for low pay. They married for security rather than love. They raised children and kept houses and lived quiet lives that history mostly forgot. But they survived, and in the context of 1849, survival itself was an achievement. And some women did not survive Oregon. They made it through the trail only to die in childbirth or from injury or from the grinding poverty that killed just as surely as cholera, only slower. The trail was not the only gauntlet. Oregon had its own dangers. Which category will you fall into? Standing here at the end of your journey, you don't know yet. You don't know if you will thrive or merely survive or eventually succumb. All you know is that you made it this far, and that has to count for something. There is a quote I keep coming back to. It is from a historian named Lillian Schlissel, who spent decades studying women's diaries from the Oregon Trail. She wrote, "The journey west was a passage through which women discovered strengths they did not know they possessed." That is you. That is what happened to you over the last 5 months. You discovered strengths you did not know you possessed. You discovered that you could walk 2,000 miles, that you could cross rivers and mountains, that you could survive disease and violence and exhaustion and despair, that you could keep going when every logical reason told you to quit. Those discoveries do not disappear just because the trail ended. You carry them with you. They become part of who you are. They shape every decision you make from this point forward. Will you marry the next man who asks, even if you do not love him, because you need security? Maybe. That is a practical choice that many women made. Or will you remember that you walked 2,000 miles alone and decide that you can build a life alone too? That you don't need a man to survive, because you have already proven you can survive anything? That is also a choice some women made. Or will you find something in between? A partnership based on mutual respect rather than desperate need? A marriage that acknowledges your strength rather than demanding you pretend to be weak? I don't know. History does not tell us your specific story because you are a composite. You're all the women who walked this trail. All the widows and orphans and runaways and dreamers who risked everything for a chance at something better. But here is what I do know. You survived. And survival means you get to make choices. You get to decide what kind of life you want to build. You get to write the next chapter. The Oregon Trail did not defeat you. It changed you. It made you harder and wiser and stronger. It took away your illusions and gave you reality. It cost you everything you brought from Missouri and gave you something more valuable in return. The knowledge that you can survive anything. That knowledge is going to serve you well in the years ahead. Because Oregon in 1849 is not easy. It is not the promised land. It is just another place where you have to fight to survive. But you know how to fight now. The trail taught you. So would you have survived? Yes. Based on your age, your timing, your luck, and your adaptability, you would have survived the Oregon Trail. 9 out of 10 people did, and you had better odds than most. But the better question is, what would you have become? Who would you have been on the other side of that journey? You would have been someone different, someone stronger, someone who knew bone deep that you could endure things you never thought possible. Someone who had walked through hell and come out the other side still breathing. At that person, that survivor, that woman who refused to die on the trail, she is worth celebrating. She is worth remembering. She is worth honoring for the incredible, impossible thing she did. The Oregon Trail is behind you now. Oregon City is below you. The rain is starting to fall. And you're about to discover that surviving the journey was just the beginning. The real test is what you do with the life you fought so hard to keep. But that is a story for another time. Right now, in this moment, let yourself feel the weight of what you accomplished. Let yourself acknowledge the miracle of your survival. Let yourself be proud. You walked 2,000 miles. You crossed a continent. You became a legend even if history forgot your name. And you did it. Against all odds, against every reasonable expectation, you did it. Welcome to Oregon. Now the real work begins. October the 3rd, 1849. 5 months and 13 days after leaving Independence, Missouri, your wagon rolls into Oregon City. You made it. Against all odds, against every reasonable expectation, you survived the Oregon Trail. You should feel triumphant. You should feel joy. You should feel relief flooding through you like the rain that is currently, soaking through your clothes and turning the streets of Oregon City into rivers of mud. Instead, you feel numb, empty, like you left pieces of yourself scattered across 2,000 miles of trail. And what arrived in Oregon is just a shell, a walking ghost, a woman who survived but is not entirely sure why. Oregon City in the fall of 1849 is not the paradise you were promised. It is a collection of rough wooden buildings clustered around Willamette Falls. There are maybe 1,000 people here, living in houses that are barely more than shacks, working in mills and shops, trying to build something that resembles civilization out of raw wilderness. It is raining. Of course it is raining. This is Oregon in October. The rain is relentless cold, turning everything to mud. You've been here for 3 hours, and you're already wetter than you ever got crossing rivers on the trail. Your first thought about Oregon is, I walked 2,000 miles for this? For rain and mud and disappointment. There is a diary entry I love from a woman named Esther Hannah, who arrived in Oregon around the same time as you. She wrote, "My most vivid recollection of that first winter in Oregon is of the weeping skies and of Mother and me also weeping. Weeping skies, weeping women. That is Oregon in the winter. That is the reality that nobody mentioned back in Missouri when they were selling you on the dream of free land and fresh starts." You find a place to camp on the outskirts of town. You cannot afford lodging. You cannot afford anything, really. Your money ran out somewhere in Idaho. You traded your last valuable possession, a silver locket that belonged to your mother, for supplies to get you through the Blue Mountains. You have your wagon, your oxen, your rifle, and approximately nothing else. And then you remember the other problem, the one you've been trying not to think about for the last 1,000 miles. The Donation Land Act, the law that promised free land to settlers. You go to the land office the next day. You wait in line for 2 hours with other bedraggled immigrants, all of you hoping to claim your piece of Oregon. When it's finally your turn, you explain your situation. You are a widow, you traveled alone, you made it all the way here, and you would like to claim land. The clerk looks at you with something between pity and annoyance. He explains slowly, like you are a child, that widows do not qualify for land grants under the Donation Land Act. The law is for married couples and unmarried single men. You do not fit either category. You are legally invisible. What can you claim? Nothing. Not 1 acre, unless you get married. Then you and your husband can claim 320 acres together. But as a widow alone, nothing. You walk out of that land office and you stand in the rain, and you feel something you have not felt in months. Not fear, not exhaustion, rage. Pure, burning, righteous rage. You walked 2,000 miles. You crossed rivers that drowned men twice your size. You survived cholera. You pulled wagons up mountains. You did everything. To be told you don't qualify for the one thing you came here for? This is the betrayal at the heart of the Oregon Trail story. The promise was a lie, not for everyone. For men, the promise mostly held true. They got their land, they built their farms, they became landowners and voters and full citizens. But for women alone, the promise was always conditional, always dependent on finding a man. Always tied to marriage. So what do you do now? You have no land, no money, no family to fall back on. You're 26 years old in a frontier town with limited opportunities for women. Your options are find a husband immediately, find work, or starve. You find work. The next day you start asking around. Who needs help? Who will pay for labor? The answer is not many people. Oregon is full of men who need wives but short on people who need to hire women. The jobs available to you are cook, seamstress, teacher if you are educated enough. All of them pay barely enough to survive. You become a laundress. You wash other people's clothes in the cold river water, your hands turning red and raw, your back aching from bending over rocks. It is the same work you watched Matilda Sager do. The same heartbreaking job of washing dirt and grease out of wool in ice-cold water. You do this for 12 hours a day, 6 days a week, for wages that barely cover food and a corner to sleep in. This is not the life you imagined. This is not why you suffered. This is not the fresh start you were promised. But here is what I want you to understand. Here is the thing that the historical record shows us. You did not give up. Women like you did not give up. They found ways to survive. They found ways to build lives, even when the system was designed to keep them dependent and powerless. Some women married. Practical marriages to men they barely knew, yes, but marriages that gave them legal rights and access to land. Some of these marriages grew into love, some did not. But they were survival strategies, and survival is not romantic. Survival is doing what you have to do to make it through another day. Some women worked for years, saved every penny, and eventually bought small pieces of land in their own names after the laws changed. It took decades. But it happened. Women became property owners, business owners. They ran boarding houses and restaurants and shops. They built lives. Some women became teachers. Oregon was desperate for education, and teaching was one of the few professions considered respectable for women. The pay was terrible, but it was steadier than laundry work and less physically brutal. And some women found community with other women. They formed networks of support. They helped each other through childbirth and sickness and grief. They shared resources and information and strength, because when the system is against you, other people who understand your struggle become your lifeline. You, standing in Oregon City in October of 1849, do not know which path you will take yet. You don't know if you will marry or work or fight or some combination of all three. You just know you survived, and that has to count for something. Let me tell you what happened to some real women who made this journey. Women whose stories were preserved because they or their descendants wrote them down. Matilda Sager, who we talked about earlier, was widowed at 24 with 5 children. She worked as a laundress. She remarried at 25 to a partner of her first husband. They moved to California, prospered, lost everything in a bad winter, and then her husband died. She was widowed again, but she kept going. She married a 3rd time. This marriage lasted. They built a successful business together. She had more children. She lived to be 77 years old. She survived. Tabitha Brown, the 66-year-old woman who jumped into a river to save a child. She arrived in Oregon nearly destitute. She had 6 cents to her name. 6 cents, but she started teaching. She helped found an orphanage that eventually became Pacific University. She became a respected community leader. She lived to be 78. She did not just survive, she thrived. And there were thousands more whose names we don't know. Women who arrived with nothing and built something anyway. Women who were told they could not and did it anyway. Women who survived the trail and then survived Oregon and left legacies in the form of children and grandchildren and communities that still exist today. 9 out of 10 immigrants who started the Oregon Trail made it to Oregon alive. That statistic always amazes me. Despite the cholera and the rivers and the mountains and the accidents and the violence, most people survived. They were tougher than anyone, including themselves, expected. And women survived at rates equal to or better than men in most age groups. They were strong, they were resilient, they were capable of more than anyone gave them credit for. So, would you have survived? That is the question we started with. If you were a woman traveling alone on the Oregon Trail in 1849, would you have made it? The answer is maybe. It depended on so many factors beyond your control. Luck, health, the kindness of strangers, the weather, the timing. Whether cholera struck your wagon train or passed you by, whether your wagon held together, whether you chose the right river crossing, whether you had the strength to keep walking when everything in you wanted to stop. But here is what I can tell you with certainty. You would have been stronger than you thought you were. You would have discovered capabilities you did not know you had. You would have done things you never imagined yourself doing. You would have survived experiences that should have broken you but somehow did not. And if you made it to Oregon, if you survived all 5 months and 2,000 miles of hell, you would have arrived as a different person than the one who left. Harder, yes. More cynical, probably. But also more confident in your own strength, more certain of your ability to survive anything, more aware of what you are capable of when survival is the only option. The Oregon Trail was not an adventure, it was a trauma, but it was also a transformation. The women who walked that trail, who survived it, who built lives in Oregon despite every obstacle, they were not victims. They were not passive passengers in someone else's story. They were fighters, survivors, pioneers in the truest sense. And their strength, their resilience, their refusal to give up even when the system was designed to defeat them, that is worth remembering. That is worth honoring. That is a legacy that matters. So here is to the women of the Oregon Trail, the ones whose names we know and the thousands whose names are lost, the ones who survived and the ones who did not, the ones who thrived in Oregon and the ones who merely endured, the ones who found love and the ones who found only hardship. All of them, every single one. They walked 2,000 miles through hell. They survived impossible odds. They built the American West with their bare hands and their bleeding feet and their stubborn, magnificent refusal to die. And you, sitting here listening to this story in 2025, you carry their legacy. You carry their strength, because we are all descended in one way or another from people who survived impossible things, who kept walking when walking seemed impossible, who chose life over and over again, even when life was brutal. That is the real lesson of the Oregon Trail. Not that it was romantic or heroic or even worth it, but that humans are tougher than we think we are. That we can endure more than seems possible. That survival itself is a victory, and that sometimes just making it through to the next day is enough. Thank you for walking this journey with me. Thank you for listening to this story, to these stories of women who have been overlooked and underestimated in the grand narrative of westward expansion. Thank you for caring about the truth behind the myth. The Oregon Trail was real, the suffering was real, the courage was real, and the women who walked it deserve to be remembered, not as footnotes or sidekicks, but as the extraordinary survivors they were. If this story moved you, if it made you think about history differently, if it made you appreciate the strength of the women who came before us, then it did its job. These stories matter. These voices matter. And as long as we keep telling them, as long as we keep remembering, they will never truly be lost. There are so many more stories to tell, so many more journeys to explore, so many more forgotten voices that deserve to be heard. And I cannot wait to share them with you. Until next time, take care of yourselves. Be kind to each other, and remember you are stronger than you know, just like the women of the Oregon Trail. Good night, sweet dreams.